It began with a city cut off from the world and a decision that suffering would be used as a weapon. Leningrad was never meant to be stormed quickly. From the very beginning, the plan was not to fight its streets block by block, but to erase it slowly, to surround it, to starve it, to let hunger, cold, and isolation finish what artillery and bombs would only begin. When the encirclement closed in the autumn of 1941, nearly 3 million people were trapped inside. Civilians, soldiers, children, the elderly. No clear escape, no reliable supply, no certainty of survival. What followed was not a single battle, but a siege that would stretch across years, a test not just of military endurance, but of human limits. As German and Finnish forces tightened the ring around the city, rail lines were severed, roads vanished under shell fire, warehouses burned, food stocks dwindled with terrifying speed. What had once been a vibrant cultural capital became an island of hunger surrounded by enemy guns. Winter arrived early and mercilessly. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Fuel ran out. Electricity failed. Apartments went dark. Water froze in pipes. People burned furniture, books, and anything else they could find just to stay alive. Bread rations shrank again and again until they were barely more than crumbs. And still, people lined up quietly, knowing the line itself might be the only thing keeping them alive one more day. The siege was not passive. Artillery shelled the city relentlessly. Bombs fell on hospitals and homes. Snipers watched streets where movement meant risk. And yet, Leningrad refused to vanish. Factories continued producing weapons under bombardment. Musicians rehearsed in freezing halls. Teachers kept schools open when possible. Life persisted not because it was easy, but because surrender was unthinkable. Hunger became the defining enemy. People weakened slowly. Then suddenly, then fatally. Diaries from the city recorded the unrecordable neighbors disappearing, families shrinking, entire apartment buildings going silent. The dead were buried in mass graves because the ground was too frozen for individual ones. Still, the city held. The only fragile lifeline came across ice. Lake Ladoga, frozen in winter, became the road of life. Trucks crossed under fire, carrying food in and evacuating the weak when possible. Many never made it. Ice broke, bombs found their marks, but enough got through to keep the city breathing. As months turned into years, the siege reshaped everything. The population was reduced by starvation and death. The defenders hardened into survivors. The city itself became a symbol beyond strategy. When Soviet forces finally broke the siege, it was not a moment of sudden liberation. It was a slow release of pressure that had been crushing human beings for nearly 900 days. The Siege of Leningrad matters because it forces us to confront what war truly means for civilians. Not just bombs and battles, but hunger used deliberately. Cold accepted as collateral. Endurance demanded without relief. It stands as one of the longest and deadliest sieges in human history, not because it was dramatic, but because it was relentless. Tonight, we return to that city under shadow, to the frozen streets and darkened apartments, to the people who endured when endurance seemed impossible, to Leningrad, where survival itself became an act of resistance. And before we continue, I want to speak to you honestly. If you're still here, listening quietly, if these long, careful journeys into history help you slow down, reflect, or sit with stories that deserve patience and respect, then I hope you'll consider subscribing. When you subscribe, you help keep this kind of slow, immersive storytelling alive. If this space gives you perspective, understanding, or simply a quiet place to listen, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the story of the Siege of Leningrad, June 21st, 1941. A Saturday evening in Leningrad, the city glows under the perpetual twilight of the white nights, that strange phenomenon of high-latitude summer where darkness never quite arrives. On Nevsky Prospect, the grand boulevard that cuts through the heart of the city, a wedding party spills out of a restaurant, the bride's white dress catching the golden light that slants across the Neva River. Children chase each other through the summer garden, their laughter echoing off the statues and fountains. Young couples stroll arm in arm past the Winter Palace, its Baroque facade painted in shades of turquoise and white, reflecting centuries of imperial grandeur. Inside the Hermitage Museum, 2 million priceless artworks rest in their galleries, watched over by silent guards. No one in this city of 3.2 million souls knows they are living the last hours of peace. 400 kilometers to the southwest, in the forests and fields along the border, another reality is taking shape. 3 million German soldiers crouch in assault positions, checking weapons, synchronizing watches, waiting for the order that will come at dawn. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, is about to begin. Adolf Hitler has spent months planning this moment, poring over maps in his headquarters, drawing arrows and circles that represent the destruction of the Soviet Union. But Leningrad occupies a special place in his obsession. This is not just another city to be conquered. This is Petrograd, the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution, the cradle of communist ideology, the city that Lenin himself renamed. In Hitler's mind, this city must not merely fall. It must be erased. Directive 1601, issued in September, would make this explicit. The Führer has decided to wipe the city of Petersburg from the face of the earth. No occupation, no preservation, total annihilation. The city sleeping beneath the white night has no idea what makes it so valuable, so dangerous, so doomed. Leningrad is the Soviet Union's second largest city, home to 2.5 million civilians and another 700,000 in the surrounding areas. It serves as the headquarters of the Baltic Fleet, controlling access to the Gulf of Finland and the Baltic Sea. Its factories produce tanks, artillery, ammunition, ships. The Kirov plant alone employs 30,000 workers building heavy machinery and armored vehicles. The city contains more than 200 museums, 8 symphony orchestras, dozens of theaters, and concert halls. It is a center of science, culture, education, prestige. To the Soviet leadership, Leningrad represents revolutionary legitimacy. To the Germans, it represents everything they are fighting to destroy. This confluence of symbolic importance and strategic value will doom the city to a fate worse than conquest. At midnight, couples still walk the embankments, watching the bridges rise to let ships pass through. University students argue philosophy in crowded cafes. Factory workers on night shift trudge toward their posts, looking forward to Sunday rest. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, watch from their headquarters on Litany Prospect, maintaining surveillance on suspected dissidents, checking lists, making arrests that will continue even as the city burns. No air raid sirens sound, no warnings have been issued. The Soviet leadership, despite months of intelligence reports, despite the massing of German forces along the border, despite warnings from spies and defectors, has convinced itself that war will not come yet. Stalin has forbidden any actions that might provoke Hitler. The Red Army stands down, unprepared, disbelieving. In this paralysis of willful blindness, the last hours of peace tick away. 3:35 in the morning, June 22nd. The German artillery opens fire along an 1,800-kilometer front. Within minutes, Soviet border posts are obliterated. Bridges explode. Communication lines go dead. By 4 in the morning, Leningrad time, the first reports reach the city, fragmentary and confused. By 7, the radio broadcasts an announcement. The motherland is at war. By noon, Nevsky Prospect is transformed. The wedding parties and Sunday strollers are gone, replaced by long lines of men registering for military service. Women and teenagers begin digging anti-tank ditches in the suburbs. Workers receive orders to convert factory production to military equipment. The city mobilizes with the frantic energy of people who understand, suddenly and completely, that everything has changed. But they do not yet understand how completely. They do not yet know about Hitler's directive. They do not yet know they are marked not for conquest, but for extermination. The German advance is staggering in its speed and violence. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, consists of 30 divisions, 725,000 men, supported by hundreds of tanks and aircraft. Their objective is clear: reach Leningrad, cut it off, destroy it. The first weeks of the campaign unfold like a military textbook demonstration of blitzkrieg doctrine. Soviet units, caught unprepared and poorly led, collapse or retreat in disorder. The Germans advanced 25 kilometers per day, crushing resistance, bypassing strong points, driving deep into Soviet territory. By the end of June, they have covered 200 kilometers. By mid-July, they are halfway to Leningrad. In Moscow, Stalin rages at his generals, demanding the impossible, threatening execution for failure. In Leningrad, the authorities begin evacuating children, cultural treasures, industrial equipment, but the evacuation is half-hearted, poorly organized, plagued by the same denial that prevented preparation. Only 636,000 people will escape before the trap closes. August arrives with the Germans less than 100 kilometers from the city. The sound of artillery can be heard in the southern suburbs. Luftwaffe bombers appear in the skies, dropping high explosives and incendiaries. The first casualties arrive at hospitals, civilians caught in the bombing, soldiers from the front, where units are being ground to pieces trying to slow the German advance. The city's defenders include not just Red Army troops, but workers' militias, hastily armed with rifles, pulled from museums and warehouses, given a few days of training, and sent to man defensive positions. Tens of thousands of women and teenagers dig defensive lines, working in shifts around the clock, transforming the approaches to Leningrad into a landscape of trenches, pillboxes, tank traps, barbed wire. The work is exhausting, dangerous, often futile. German artillery finds the work parties. Luftwaffe fighters strafe them. But the digging continues because there is nothing else to do. Because work feels like resistance. Because stopping means admitting defeat. August 8th. German panzers capture Maga railway station, 50 kilometers southeast of Leningrad, cutting the last direct rail connection to Moscow. The noose begins to tighten. August 30th. The fall of Maga itself, a small town that will become a name spoken with dread. September 8th, 1941, the day that will mark the beginning of the siege. German forces capture Schlisselburg, a fortress town on the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, the last remaining ground link to unoccupied Soviet territory. The ring closes. 2.8 million people are now trapped inside a city that has enough food for 35 days. The same day, as if to mark the occasion, German bombers strike the Badaev warehouses in the southern part of the city. These warehouses contain 3,000 tons of flour and 2,500 tons of sugar, a significant portion of the city's reserves. The bombs ignite the stored goods, creating fires that burn for hours, sending a sweet, sickly smell across the city as sugar melts and caramelizes. Residents will later claim they could taste the burning sugar in the air. For many, it is the last sweet thing they will experience for years. September 15th. A telegram arrives from Moscow, addressed to General Georgy Zhukov, who Stalin has just appointed to command Leningrad's defense after dismissing the previous commander for incompetence. The telegram is brief and brutal. Leningrad must not fall. If you cannot hold it, blow up the Baltic fleet and die defending the city. This is not rhetoric. Stalin means it literally. Zhukov, a hard man even by Soviet standards, understands immediately that he has been given an impossible task with fatal consequences for failure. He begins preparing demolition charges throughout the city, mining the major buildings, the factories, the bridges, ready to destroy everything rather than let the Germans have it. He orders mass arrests of anyone suspected of defeatism, anyone spreading panic, anyone questioning the defense. Thousands are executed in the first weeks of his command. But Zhukov also brings competence, organization, ruthlessness directed at the enemy rather than just his own troops. The German advance, which had seemed unstoppable, begins to slow as it runs into fortified positions manned by soldiers who know they will be shot if they retreat. By the end of September, the front lines stabilize. The Germans control the southern approaches, the western approaches, and the eastern approaches along Lake Ladoga. Finnish forces, allied with Germany, hold the north. Leningrad sits at the center of this ring, cut off from resupply except by air or across Lake Ladoga. The Germans are close enough that their artillery can reach most of the city. At night, Leningraders can see the flash of German guns on the horizon, can count the seconds before the shells arrive. The city that 3 months ago was filled with wedding parties and strolling couples is now a fortress under siege. The grand boulevards are lined with anti-tank obstacles. The beautiful parks hide anti-aircraft guns. The museums are empty, their treasures evacuated or hidden in basements. And in the offices of the city's food supply administration, a man named Dmitry Pavlov sits at his desk, staring at ledgers that contain the arithmetic of doom. He has just completed the first comprehensive inventory since the encirclement. The numbers tell him that at current consumption rates, the city has 35 days of food remaining. Winter is coming. There is no way out. And Pavlov, who is responsible for feeding 2.8 million people, must now decide how to make the impossible calculation of who eats and who dies. August 8th, 1941, early morning. A German reconnaissance unit rolls into Emga railway station, 47 kilometers southeast of Leningrad. The station is deserted except for a single locomotive sitting on the tracks, steam still rising from its boiler, abandoned so recently that the engineer's T-glass remains on the control panel, still warm. Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann walks through the station building, his boots echoing on the tile floor, finding offices with papers scattered across desks, a canteen with half-eaten breakfasts on tables, a telegraph room with machines still clicking out messages from a network that no longer exists. He steps outside and looks northwest, toward Leningrad, invisible beyond the forest but close enough that he imagines he can see the smoke from its factories. Within hours, German engineers will rip up the tracks heading toward Moscow, cutting the last direct rail link between Leningrad and the rest of the Soviet Union. Hartmann does not know it yet, but he has just participated in the first step of encircling 3 million people. The encirclement of Leningrad is not a sudden event, but a methodical process, a noose tightening day by day throughout August and early September. Army Group North advances along multiple axes, each thrust designed to cut another connection between the city and the Soviet interior. On August 30th, German forces capture Emga itself, not just the railway station, but the entire town, pushing Soviet defenders back toward Leningrad. On September 1st, they take Tosno, cutting the last highway link. On September 4th, German artillery begins shelling the outskirts of Leningrad itself, announcing that the attackers are now close enough to strike the city directly. Each of these advances creates panic in Leningrad. Waves of refugees fleeing ahead of the German columns, reports arriving at headquarters in fragments, often wrong, always terrifying. The Soviet command struggles to understand where the Germans are, how many, what their objectives might be. Information arrives too late or not at all. Units lose contact with headquarters. Defensive lines collapse before commanders know they are under attack. September 8th, 1941, the critical day. German forces capture Schlisselburg, a fortress town sitting where the Neva River flows out of Lake Ladoga, 35 kilometers east of Leningrad. The capture of this single town completes the encirclement because it cuts the last remaining ground route out of the city. Now Leningrad has only 2 connections to unoccupied Soviet territory: across Lake Ladoga, a treacherous water route that will freeze solid in winter, or by air, which requires flying through German fighter coverage and anti-aircraft fire. The ring is closed. Inside it are approximately 2.8 million people, including 2.5 million civilians and 300,000 military personnel. Outside the ring is the rest of the world, suddenly and completely unreachable by normal means. The siege has begun, though no one yet uses that word. The Soviet press speaks of temporary difficulties and heroic defense. The military command speaks of breakthrough operations and counteroffensives. But in the offices where food supplies are calculated, in the hospitals already filling with wounded, in the apartments where families gather to listen to the radio, people are beginning to understand that something unprecedented is happening. The same day the ring closes, the Luftwaffe launches its largest air raid yet against Leningrad. 276 bombers, wave after wave throughout the afternoon and evening, dropping high explosives and incendiaries. The primary target is the Badeev warehouses in the southern Moskovsky district, a complex of wooden buildings storing food reserves. The first wave arrives at 6 in the evening, hitting the warehouses with incendiary bombs that start fires in the stored flour, sugar, oil, and fats. Within an hour, the entire complex is ablaze, flames visible across half the city, smoke rising in a black column that can be seen 50 kilometers away. Firefighters arrive but cannot control the blaze. The heat is too intense. Explosions rock the complex as stored materials ignite. By midnight, the fires are still burning. By dawn, the Badaev warehouses are gone, reduced to smoking ruins and pools of melted sugar that soak into the ground. The official loss is 3,000 tons of flour and 2,500 tons of sugar. Some historians argue the actual losses were smaller, that most food had already been distributed, but the symbolic impact is devastating. Leningraders will remember the sweet smell of burning sugar for the rest of their lives. Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, commander of Army Group North, sits in his headquarters reviewing reports from his divisions now surrounding Leningrad. He is 65 years old, a professional soldier of the old school, uncomfortable with the Nazi regime, but unwilling to refuse its orders. His forces have advanced 600 kilometers in 77 days, an achievement by any military standard. But now he faces a dilemma. Hitler's orders are clear. Do not assault the city directly. Do not accept surrender. Do not occupy. Instead, surround and starve. Artillery and bombing will do the rest. Lieb understands military siegecraft, but this is something different. This is not siege warfare aimed at forcing surrender. This is siege warfare aimed at extermination. His artillery officers calculate that they can reach most of the city center from their current positions. His infantry holds strong defensive positions that the Soviets cannot break. His logistics officers assure him that his forces can maintain the siege indefinitely. But Lieb also sees problems. His divisions are tired, under strength, spread across a 200-kilometer perimeter. Winter is coming, and German soldiers lack proper cold weather equipment. And holding this perimeter ties down 30 divisions that could be used elsewhere in the drive toward Moscow that is now beginning. He writes in his diary that night, "We have surrounded the city, but at what cost?" Inside Leningrad, Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, Stalin's old comrade from the Civil War, is failing to organize an effective defense. Voroshilov is politically reliable but militarily incompetent, a relic of an earlier era who commands through bluster and threats rather than strategic competence. His attempts to organize breakout attacks fail catastrophically, wasting troops in poorly planned assaults against prepared German positions. His defensive lines are penetrated repeatedly. His headquarters issues contradictory orders, creating confusion among subordinate commanders. By early September, the situation is deteriorating so rapidly that Stalin realizes he must act. On September 9th, he sends Georgy Zhukov, his most capable general, to take command. Zhukov arrives by air, landing at an airfield under artillery fire, and immediately begins a ruthless reorganization. He dismisses incompetent officers on the spot. He orders the execution of soldiers found abandoning positions. He tours the front lines personally, appearing at critical points, radiating an iron determination that begins to stiffen Soviet resistance. Within days of Zhukov's arrival, the German advance halts. But halting the German advance does not mean breaking the encirclement. Throughout September, Soviet forces launched desperate attacks, trying to reopen ground connections to the east. The Sinyavino offensive, beginning September 10th, throws fresh divisions against German positions near Schlisselburg, trying to break through the narrow corridor separating Leningrad from the main Soviet lines. The offensive is a bloodbath. Soviet troops attack across open ground into prepared German defensive positions. German artillery and machine guns cut them down in waves. Some units lose 70% casualties in a single day. The offensive achieves nothing, except to fill the hospitals with wounded and the cemeteries with dead. A second offensive in late September achieves equally nothing at even higher cost. By October, Zhukov must accept the reality. Leningrad cannot be relieved by direct military action, not with the forces available, not against the German positions. The city is trapped, and will remain trapped through the winter. The encirclement has happened with stunning speed, but the Soviet evacuation has been tragically slow. From June to September, only 636,000 people are evacuated from Leningrad, less than 20% of the population. Why so few? Partly denial, the authorities did not believe the city could actually be cut off until it was too late. Partly bureaucracy, the evacuation system required mountains of paperwork, permits, travel orders, all of which took time that did not exist. Partly, ideology evacuating civilians looked like defeatism, and defeatism could get officials shot. Partly, logistics. The railway network was overwhelmed moving military supplies and industrial equipment. The result is catastrophic. By September 8th, when the ring closes, 2.2 million civilians remain in the city, trapped. They include 400,000 children. They include 100,000 elderly. They include families who waited for evacuation orders that never came, workers who stayed at their posts because they were told they were needed, mothers who refused to leave without their husbands at the front. All of them are now prisoners of geography, trapped between German artillery and the approaching winter. September 15th. Zhukov receives Stalin's telegram. Leningrad must not fall. If you cannot hold it, blow up the Baltic fleet and die defending the city. This is not hyperbole. Stalin has ordered demolition charges placed throughout the city, mining all major buildings, all bridges, all factories. If the Germans break through, Leningrad will be destroyed by its defenders rather than captured. Zhukov acknowledges the order and sets about implementing it, knowing that Stalin's threats are not idle. He has seen Stalin have generals shot for lesser failures than losing Leningrad. At the same time, Zhukov begins to understand the real horror of the situation. The military forces can be supplied by air and across Lake Ladoga. Ammunition, fuel, replacement weapons, even some food for the soldiers, all this can be brought in. But feeding 2 million civilians through the winter, with the city cut off, with the lake freezing, with only air transport available, the mathematics are impossible. Zhukov is not a sentimental man, but even he can see what is coming. He writes to Stalin requesting permission to evacuate civilians across Lake Ladoga before it freezes. Stalin refuses. The civilians will stay. They will work in the factories producing ammunition and weapons. They will defend the city, and if they die, they will die as Soviet citizens should, at their posts, serving the state. By the end of September, the front lines have stabilized into the configuration they will hold, with minor variations, for the next 2.5 years. The Germans control a perimeter roughly 200 kilometers long, running from the Finnish positions in the north, south, and west around the city to Lake Ladoga in the east. They are close. In some sectors, German forward positions are within 10 kilometers of the city center. German artillery can reach Nevsky Prospect. German observers can see the golden spire of the Admiralty building through their binoculars, but they will come no closer. Zhukov's defensive lines, manned by troops who know that retreat means execution and that the city behind them contains their families, prove impossible to break without casualties. The Germans are unwilling to accept. A stalemate emerges, not of equals, but of exhaustion and calculation. The Germans cannot take the city without losses that would cripple Army Group North. The Soviets cannot break the encirclement without forces they do not have. And so, the ring remains closed, the siege continues, and the city inside the ring begins its descent into a winter of death that will claim more lives than any battle of the war. September 10th, 1941, late evening. Dmitry Pavlov sits alone in his office in the Smolny Institute, the headquarters of Leningrad's civil administration. He is the city's food supply director, a position that was bureaucratic and boring just 3 months ago, and is now the most terrible job in the Soviet Union. In front of him lie ledgers containing the results of the first complete inventory since the German encirclement 2 days ago. He has spent 12 hours checking the numbers, recalculating, hoping to find an error, any error that might change the arithmetic. There is no error. The numbers are exact, merciless, final. At current ration rates, the city has 35 days of grain flour, 33 days of meat, 45 days of fats. After that, the food runs out. Winter will last at least 5 months. Pavlov is not a man given to emotion, but sitting in the dark office, listening to distant artillery, he allows himself one moment of complete honesty. The city is going to starve. The mathematics of siege warfare are simple and brutal. A city needs a certain amount of food per day, multiplied by its population. If supply falls below that threshold, people starve. If supply stops completely, everyone starves. Just a question of when. Leningrad's problem is quantifiable, with terrible precision. The city needs approximately 2,500 tons of food per day to sustain its population at survival levels. This is not abundance. This is the bare minimum to prevent starvation. Bread, a little meat, some fats, some vegetables. Before the encirclement, the city was supplied primarily by railway, with train after train arriving from the agricultural regions to the south and east. That supply network is now cut. The city has only what was stored in warehouses, and the Batayev fire has destroyed 10% of those reserves in a single night. Pavlov's inventory reveals that, even with the strictest rationing, the city cannot survive until spring on its existing reserves. Something else must be done. But what? September 12th, the first ration reduction. This is the moment when most Leningraders begin to understand that something is seriously wrong. Until now, rationing has been an inconvenience, not a crisis. But the new rations, announced on the radio and posted on notices throughout the city, represent a real reduction in available food. Workers in critical industries receive 500 grams of bread per day. Other workers get 400 grams. Employees and children receive 300 grams. These amounts sound almost adequate until you understand that bread means this is almost the only food being distributed. A little meat when available, scarce fats, no fresh vegetables, no milk except for infants. The bread itself is already degraded, containing less wheat flour than before, more filler, more of what Pavlov calls technological materials, anything that can be ground up and mixed into the dough to extend supplies. 500 grams of this bread provides perhaps 1,200 calories. An adult needs 2,000 to maintain weight, 2,500 if working manual labor. The deficit begins immediately. October 1st, another reduction. Workers now receive 400 grams, everyone else 300. The bread is darker now, heavier, harder to chew. The flour is running out, being replaced by rye meal, then by oat dust, swept from the floors of empty grain elevators. The city's food scientists work frantically to find anything that can be made edible. They experiment with cellulose, the plant fiber used to make paper. It can be processed into a powder and mixed into bread dough, adding no nutrition but increasing volume. They investigate cottonseed cake, the solid residue left after oil extraction, normally used for cattle feed. It contains protein but also toxic compounds that must be removed by a complex chemical process. They examine wallpaper, paste, made from potato starch, stored in thousands of kilograms in the city's warehouses. It can be dissolved and added to soup. None of these are food in any real sense, but they are mass. They are something to put in the stomach. They create the illusion of eating. November 10th, the fourth reduction. Workers receive 300 grams of bread, everyone else 200. This is the point where starvation begins to kill in significant numbers, where the mathematics become homicidal. 200 grams of degraded bread provides perhaps 500 calories per day. A sedentary adult needs 800 calories just to maintain basic metabolic function, to keep the heart beating and the brain working. At 500 calories, the body begins consuming itself, burning muscle tissue for energy, shutting down non-essential functions, slowing metabolism to extend survival. How long can a human live on 500 calories per day? It depends on the person, their reserves of body fat, their age, their health. A healthy adult might survive 2 months. An elderly person or a child, much less. Throughout November, doctors see a sharp increase in what they call alimentary dystrophy clinical starvation. The symptoms are predictable: weakness, swelling from edema, mental confusion, susceptibility to cold and disease, and then, for thousands, death. November 20th, the catastrophic reduction. The moment when everyone in Leningrad understands that the city is dying. Workers in critical industries receive 250 grams of bread. Everyone else, clerks, teachers, elderly, children, housewives, the unemployed, receives 125 grams. 125 grams is approximately one small slice of bread, or one thin roll. This amount provides roughly 250 calories, less than a quarter of what a human needs to survive. There is no possibility of maintaining life on this ration. The body will consume all its fat reserves in days, then begin destroying muscle tissue, including heart muscle. Starvation is now universal. no longer a threat but a reality for every civilian in the city. Pavlov knows this. The city's leaders know this. The doctors know this. Everyone knows this. The ration system is no longer feeding the population but determining the speed at which they die. Yet Pavlov continues to work 18-hour days, calculating, experimenting, searching for anything that might extend supplies by even a few days. His staff scours the city for forgotten reserves. They find a warehouse containing 10,000 tons of sheep guts, stored for industrial use, inedible by any normal standard but containing protein. They boil it, filter it, process it, and distribute it as gelatin. They find stocks of malt, used for brewing, and add it to the bread formula. They scrape oil residue from the walls of storage tanks and distribute it as fat. They teach people to boil leather belts, shoes, harnesses to extract a gel that can be eaten, providing minimal nutrition but something to put in the stomach. They publish instructions for eating wallpaper paste, carpenter's glue, petroleum jelly processed to remove toxic compounds. These are not solutions but delays, ways to extend the dying by days or weeks. December 25th, 1941. Christmas in Europe, though not celebrated in the officially atheist Soviet Union. For Leningrad, it marks the lowest point of the food crisis. Rations are cut one final time to the absolute minimum, 125 grams for workers, 75 grams for everyone else. 75 grams is less than 3 ounces, a piece of bread smaller than a modern hamburger bun. This provides approximately 150 calories per day. At this level, death is not a possibility, but a mathematical certainty. An average adult has perhaps 30 days of life remaining, assuming they are not working, not exposed to cold, not sick. In reality, people are working 12-hour shifts in unheated factories, walking miles to work through snow because the trams have stopped, living in apartments where the temperature is below freezing because there is no fuel for heating. Under these conditions, the timeline from health to death compresses to weeks. Hospitals begin to fill not with wounded from the front, but with civilians dying of starvation. The bread itself, by December, is barely recognizable as food. The official formula, recorded in Pavlov's archives, tells the story of progressive desperation. In September, the bread was 50% rye flour, 30% wheat flour, 20% barley. By October, it was 60% rye flour, 20% oat flour, 20% barley. By November, it was 50% defective rye flour, 30% oat dust, 10% malt, 10% cellulose. By December, it was even worse. 30% defective rye flour, 20% oat dust, 20% barley dust, 10% malt, 10% cellulose, 10% sawdust. This mixture is black, heavy, sometimes containing chips of wood or bits of paper. It tastes of nothing, or worse than nothing. But it is what keeps people alive. If the word alive can be used to describe the skeletal figures shuffling through the streets, too weak to brush snow off their coats, stopping every few steps to rest, dying where they stand. Pavlov keeps working because there is nothing else to do. He calculates that if the ice on Lake Ladoga becomes solid enough to support truck traffic, supplies can be brought across from the Soviet-held eastern shore. He calculates how much food must arrive each day to prevent total starvation, 1,500 tons minimum, 2,500 tons to slowly improve conditions. He calculates the transportation capacity of trucks crossing ice. Each truck carries perhaps 3 tons, making the journey takes 12 hours round trip. Ice can support limited traffic before becoming unstable. The mathematics are still nearly impossible, but nearly impossible is better than certain death. Throughout November and early December, reconnaissance teams walk across the freezing lake, measuring ice thickness, marking routes, testing whether the ice can support even horse-drawn sleds. By mid-December, the first convoys begin to cross. They bring flour, they bring hope, they bring the possibility that the city might survive until spring. But even with the ice road operating, the supplies arriving are not enough to end starvation, only to slow it. The mathematics remain brutal. More people need food than food is arriving. The dying continues and will continue. And Pavlov sits in his dark office calculating how to allocate the suffering, how to decide who eats and who dies, the most terrible mathematics any bureaucrat has ever had to solve. November 20th, 1941, dawn. 3 Soviet engineers stand at the edge of Lake Ladoga, staring at the ice forming on the surface. Their names are not recorded in most histories, but their work will save hundreds of thousands of lives. They carry measuring tools, ice augers to drill through and measure thickness, thermometers to gauge air and water temperature, notebooks to record data. The ice is forming irregularly, thick in some places, dangerously thin in others, affected by currents, wind, temperature fluctuations. The engineers begin walking across the lake, drilling every 100 meters, calling out measurements. 18 centimeters here, 12 centimeters there, 20 centimeters over here. The safe minimum for horse-drawn sleds is 20 centimeters. For loaded trucks, 30 centimeters. They need 60 centimeters for heavy equipment. The ice is not ready, but it needs to be ready. The city is starving. Every day of delay kills thousands. Lake Ladoga is enormous, the largest lake in Europe, stretching 190 kilometers north to south and 130 kilometers east to west. But the siege has compressed its significance to a single route. The 30-kilometer crossing from the western shore near Ozinovets, inside the Soviet lines just northeast of Leningrad, to the eastern shore near Kobona and Lavrovo, in territory securely held by the Red Army. This crossing is the only physical connection between besieged Leningrad and the rest of the Soviet Union. During summer and early autumn, boats and barges made the journey, often under German air attack, bringing supplies into the city and evacuating people out. But by November, the lake is freezing, too icy for boats but not yet solid enough for vehicles. For several weeks, there is no way across at all. The city's food reserves drain away during this gap. The ice road must open soon, or the city will die. November 22nd, the first convoy. The ice is only 18 centimeters thick, below the safe minimum, but waiting is not an option. The convoy consists of horse-drawn sleds, lighter than trucks, with drivers who have volunteered knowing the risks. They set out at dawn, following the route marked by the reconnaissance team, moving slowly, testing the ice with every step. The horses sense the danger, pulling nervously, ears flat. The drivers listen for the sounds everyone fears: the crack of ice splitting, the groan of ice settling, the splash of water as ice breaks. 3 kilometers out, a horse breaks through, thrashing in the freezing water. The driver cuts it loose, saving himself and the sled, leaving the horse to drown or freeze. 5 kilometers out, an entire sled disappears, ice collapsing, horse and driver and cargo gone in seconds. The convoy continues. Turning back achieves nothing. By late afternoon, the surviving sleds reach the eastern shore. 350 tons of flour delivered. It is nowhere near enough, but it is something. December 6th, the ice is finally thick enough for trucks. The first motorized convoy assembles at Osinovets, 60 Gaz AA trucks, each loaded with flour and grain, carrying roughly 3 tons per vehicle. The drivers have been briefed on the procedure. Drive slowly. Maintain spacing between vehicles to distribute weight. Watch for pressure ridges and thin spots. Keep moving, because stopping allows ice to crack under concentrated weight. The convoy sets out at dawn. The crossing should take 3 hours. It takes 5 because the drivers must navigate around weak sections, backtrack when scouts flag dangerous ice, stop to repair trucks that break down. German reconnaissance aircraft spot the convoy and radio for bombers, but the bombers arrive too late, after the trucks have reached the relative safety of the eastern shore. All 60 trucks make it across. 350 tons delivered. Still not enough, but more than horses could carry. This is the beginning. By mid-December, the ice road is operating at scale, a continuous stream of trucks moving in both directions. Supply trucks heading west to Leningrad, empty trucks returning east, and trucks carrying evacuees, living cargo more precious than food. The route becomes formalized, marked with flags and poles, with checkpoints every few kilometers where guards monitor ice conditions and assist broken-down vehicles. Engineers monitor the ice constantly, measuring thickness, watching for cracks, noting changes in temperature and weather that affect ice stability. The lake is not cooperative. In some winters, Lake Ladoga freezes smooth and solid. This winter, 1941 to 42, It freezes rough and unpredictable. Pressure ridges form where moving ice plates collide, creating barriers that must be cut through or bypassed. Polinia open water areas appear without warning, forcing convoys to detour. And always, there is the fear that the ice will fail catastrophically, swallowing multiple trucks at once. The losses are heavy but not catastrophic. On average, 1 truck in 20 does not return. Sometimes the ice breaks and the truck sinks in water too deep for recovery, driver and cargo lost. Sometimes trucks break down and cannot be repaired before German artillery finds them. Sometimes German fighters strafe the ice, killing drivers or puncturing fuel tanks. Sometimes, most mysteriously, trucks simply disappear, presumed to have broken through ice and sunk without witnesses. The Soviets keep meticulous records. 1,004 trucks lost through the winter, approximately 300 drivers killed, countless more injured or suffering frostbite. These are acceptable losses in the calculus of siege warfare. For every truck lost, 19 make it through. For every driver killed, 10 deliver their cargo. The road functions, not well, not safely, but adequately. January 1942, peak operations. The ice is now thick enough to support heavy traffic, and the Soviet command has mobilized every available truck. On busy days, 3,500 vehicles are on the ice simultaneously, a moving traffic jam stretching across the frozen lake. Drivers work in shifts around the clock. There is no rest, no pause, because every hour of downtime means fewer supplies delivered. At night, the road becomes surreal. Hundreds of trucks creeping across ice in darkness, headlights off to avoid attracting German attention, drivers navigating by moonlight or by following the truck ahead. The sound of engines echoes across the frozen lake. The temperature drops to -30 or -40. Drivers must stop every hour to warm their engines, to check that fuel has not frozen in the lines, to beat their arms against their bodies to maintain circulation. Frostbite is common. Drivers lose fingers, toes, ears, but they keep driving because the alternative is watching Leningrad starve. By February, the Germans have identified the ice road as a critical target and begin systematic efforts to interdict it. Artillery batteries on the south shore of Lake Ladoga open fire whenever convoys are spotted, sending shells screaming across the ice. The shells create strange effects. When they hit ice, they create craters filled with water that quickly freezes, creating fresh hazards. Direct hits on trucks destroy vehicle and cargo, leaving burning wrecks that mark danger zones. The Luftwaffe increases air raids, sending fighters and bombers to attack the road and its endpoints. Soviet anti-aircraft defenses proliferate, turning the lake crossing into a gauntlet of fire from both above and below. Drivers adopt new tactics, driving at night despite the dangers, taking evasive routes, moving in small groups rather than large convoys. The losses increase, but the supplies keep flowing. The ice road saves Leningrad, but barely. Through the winter of 1941 to 42, it delivers 361,000 tons of supplies into the city. This sounds like a lot until you calculate what the city actually needed. 2,500 tons per day for 150 days equals 375,000 tons minimum. The road delivered 96% of the bare minimum. This is why the winter is so deadly, why hundreds of thousands starve. The road works, but it works just barely, delivering enough to keep the city alive, but not enough to prevent catastrophic death rates. At the same time, the road evacuates 539,000 people, mostly children, elderly, sick, people who would otherwise consume scarce food. This evacuation is its own nightmare. Evacuees packed into unheated trucks, wearing inadequate clothing, often already starving, making the freezing journey to the eastern shore, where they are loaded onto trains heading east. Some die during the crossing, more die on the trains. But for those who survive, the ice road is salvation, the narrow thread connecting them to life. April 1942, spring thaw. The ice begins to rot from below, becoming porous, unstable, deadly. Truck traffic stops in early April, but horse-drawn sleds continue for another 2 weeks, drivers taking insane risks because every load matters. The last convoy crosses on April 24th, when the ice is so thin that horses break through with each step, when sleds must be dragged rather than pulled. when drivers walk on foot distributing their weight. The next day, the ice is completely gone, the lake open water again. The first winter of the siege is over. The ice road has done what seemed impossible. It kept the city supplied enough to survive. Not supplied well, not supplied adequately, but supplied enough that the city did not die completely. Over the summer, boats will resume the supply mission, but everyone knows that when winter returns, the ice road must open again. The engineers are already planning, calculating, preparing, because the siege continues and Lake Ladoga remains the only lifeline, and the ice must hold, must hold, must hold. December 11th, 1941, afternoon. A woman walks down Nevsky Prospect, pulling a child's sled behind her. On the sled lies a body wrapped in a sheet, frozen solid, the face covered. The woman walks slowly, stopping every few meters to rest, her breath coming in gasps, her legs barely supporting her weight. Other pedestrians pass her without comment, without staring, because this scene has become common. Everyone on Nevsky Prospect is pulling or carrying bodies, or soon will be. The cemeteries are overwhelmed. The morgues are full. Bodies accumulate in apartments, in hallways, in courtyards, frozen solid by temperatures that have not risen above -20 for 2 weeks. The woman reaches Piskarovskoye Cemetery on the northern edge of the city and joins a line of hundreds of others, all with their sleds, their bundles, their frozen dead. At the cemetery gate, workers stack bodies like firewood, because the ground is too frozen to dig graves and there is no fuel to burn the dead. The winter of 1941 to 42 has begun, and it will kill more people than all of World War II's battles combined in a single city. Starvation does not kill quickly or cleanly. It is a process, a series of degradations, each stage stripping away another layer of humanity. The doctors in Leningrad's hospitals document the progression with clinical precision, creating the first comprehensive medical study of mass starvation. Stage 1. Hunger. The body begins burning fat reserves, weight loss begins, energy levels drop, people become obsessed with food, talking about recipes, remembering meals, dreaming of bread. Stage 2. Exhaustion. Fat reserves are depleted, the body begins consuming muscle tissue, including heart muscle. People become weak, unable to climb stairs, unable to work full shifts, stopping frequently to rest. Stage 3. Alimentary dystrophy, clinical starvation. The body swells with edema as proteins break down and fluid accumulates in tissues. The face becomes puffy, the legs swell, the body becomes misshapen. Mental function deteriorates, confusion, memory loss, inability to concentrate. Stage 4. Death, usually from heart failure or infection, as the body simply shuts down. The dying happens everywhere, in every apartment, on every street. A mother's diary entry, December 15th. Valia died this morning. She was 8 years old. I found her in bed, not breathing, frozen. I do not have the strength to move her body. Mitya is very weak. I think he will die soon also. I must get their ration cards before the end of the day. Otherwise, we lose tomorrow's bread. This is the calculus of starvation. Grief must wait. Emotional processing must wait, because practical survival requires immediate action. Ration cards belong to individuals. When an individual dies, the card becomes invalid. But if the death is not reported immediately, the card can be used 1 more day, 2 more days, until authorities notice. Thousands of Leningraders hide deaths for this reason, propping up corpses, pretending dead family members are merely sleeping, collecting rations meant for people who are no longer alive. This is not greed, but desperation, the margin between life and death measured in bread crusts. The streets become surreal, a city of shuffling skeletons. People walk with a characteristic gait, the Leningrad shuffle, feet barely lifting, bodies swaying, stopping every few steps to lean against walls or sit on snowbanks. Falling is dangerous because getting up requires more energy than many people possess. The sidewalks are littered with bodies, some recently dead, others frozen weeks ago, all covered in snow so that they resemble strange sculptures, human-shaped drifts. No one stops to check them. No one has the energy to care. The living are barely distinguishable from the dead, except by movement. Everyone wears every piece of clothing they own, layer upon layer, creating shapeless bundles that shuffle through the cold. Faces disappear into wrappings. Gender becomes impossible to determine. Age becomes meaningless when everyone looks ancient. The Haymarket, Leningrad's traditional farmers' market, transforms into the black market of the damned. Here, if you have money or valuables, you can buy food at prices that would have been unthinkable before the war. A cat, killed and butchered, sells for 500 rubles, 2 weeks' wages at pre-war rates. A piece of carpenter's glue, which can be boiled and eaten, costs 100 rubles. A loaf of real bread, made from actual flour without additives, costs 1,200 rubles, enough to buy a motorcycle before the war. People sell everything: wedding rings, family photographs, clothing, books, musical instruments, anything that might be traded for food. The NKVD watches the market, making arrests for speculation and profiteering, sometimes executing sellers on the spot. But the market continues because hunger overrides fear, because people will risk execution for the chance to eat. And at the market's darkest corners, in whispered transactions, another trade occurs: human meat. The NKVD will make 2,000 arrests for cannibalism during the siege. 586 people will be executed for it. The public library reading room presents a particularly eerie scene. Scholars continue to come to work, to read, to research, because work provides structure, and structure provides sanity. But increasingly, readers die at their desks. They sit down to read, open a book, and simply do not get up. The librarians find them hours or days later, frozen in position, hands still holding books, faces peaceful. The library becomes a tomb where the dead study eternally. In factories, workers collapse at their machines, dying mid-shift, and their bodies are carried away while the next worker takes their place. In hospitals, patients die in their beds, and the bodies remain because there is nowhere to take them. In apartment buildings, entire families die together, found weeks later frozen in their beds, 3 generations erased in silence. Children suffer uniquely because they have fewer reserves, because their bodies cannot tolerate cold as well, because they do not understand what is happening. A teacher's diary, January 1942. Only 12 students came to class today, down from 37 last month. I do not know where the others are. We assume they are dead, but no one speaks of it. We do lessons, but the children cannot concentrate. They sit staring at nothing, or fall asleep, or weep quietly. I have no energy to teach properly. I gave them a writing assignment. Describe your favorite meal. They wrote about soup, bread, sugar, simple things. I collected the papers and several students had written the same thing in different words. I want to eat and not die. I did not know what to grade this. By late January 1942, the death rate reaches its peak, 3,000 to 4,000 people per day, 125 deaths per hour, more than 2 per minute. The city's population is declining so rapidly that officials stop trying to count. Bodies accumulate faster than they can be collected. The collection teams, called corpse brigades, work continuously, pulling sleds through the streets, gathering the frozen dead, transporting them to collection points. But the teams themselves are starving, moving slowly, unable to collect more than a few dozen bodies per day. The corpses pile up at intersections, outside hospitals, in courtyards. The stench is suppressed by cold, but everyone knows that when spring comes, when the thaw arrives, the smell will be unbearable. February brings no relief. The rations remain at their lowest levels. The ice road is delivering supplies, but not enough, not nearly enough. People continue to die at massive rates, but something begins to change in the survivors, a hardening, an adaptation. The people who have survived this long develop survival strategies, ways to preserve energy, to find scraps of food, to keep moving despite weakness. They develop an ability to ignore suffering, to walk past bodies without seeing them, to think only of the next meal, the next hour. This is not recovery, but a kind of hibernation, reducing life to its barest essence. Breath, movement, hunger. The city becomes populated by ghosts, people who are alive but barely, who have crossed some threshold where death is familiar and life is strange. March brings the first hints that the worst might be passing. Rations increase slightly, not to adequacy, but to a level where death rates begin to decline. The increase as tiny bread rations go from 125 grams to 200 grams. Still starvation, but slower starvation. The ice road is delivering more supplies as the ice becomes more stable. People begin to believe they might survive until spring, might live to see the lake open for boat traffic, might last until food can be brought in adequate quantities. But belief in survival does not erase the winter's toll. The exact number of dead will never be known precisely. Soviet authorities later claim 63,000 died during the worst winter months. Modern historians, using multiple data sources, estimate 400,000 to 600,000 civilian deaths between November 1941 and March 1942. 400,000 to 600,000 people dead in 4 months in a single city from starvation and cold. This is the winter of ghosts, when Leningrad became a necropolis, when death was so common that life became remarkable, when the city learned that humans can endure almost anything, except, for hundreds of thousands, they cannot. March 27, 1942, dawn. Radio Leningrad broadcasts an announcement that will be repeated every hour throughout the day. All citizens capable of working must report to their designated districts for cleanup duty. Bring shovels, scrapers, any tools you possess. The city must be cleaned. This is not a request, but an order, and it carries the weight of survival. Winter has buried Leningrad under snow and ice, and beneath that snow lies evidence of the catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of corpses, frozen in streets and courtyards, waiting to be revealed by the spring thaw. If these bodies are not collected before warm weather, disease will finish what starvation started. The cleanup will be the largest mass mobilization of civilians in the siege, an attempt to reclaim the city from death itself. 300,000 Leningraders, mostly women because most men are either dead or fighting at the front, assemble in brigades throughout the city. They are skeletal figures, many barely able to walk, wearing layers of ragged clothing, carrying tools that feel impossibly heavy in their weakened hands. They begin the work of spring cleaning on a scale unimaginable in peacetime. They shovel snow that has accumulated to depths of 1.5 meters in some streets. They chip ice from sidewalks and roadways. They clear drainage channels clogged with frozen debris, and they collect bodies. The bodies are everywhere. Some lie on sidewalks where people collapsed and died, covered by months of snow. Some are in courtyards, stacked by families who had no strength to move them further. Some are in apartments, in stairwells, in basements. The work is exhausting, horrifying, necessary. The body collection follows a grim procedure. Teams of 4 to 6 women, because women are more likely to have survived, pull sleds through neighborhoods, stopping at every building to search for corpses. They knock on apartment doors, receiving no answer from units where everyone has died. They enter these apartments, finding frozen tableau, families in bed together, elderly people alone in chairs, children curled in corners. The bodies must be carried downstairs, often multiple flights, by people who can barely carry their own weight. The bodies are loaded onto sleds and dragged through streets to collection points, usually parks or squares where trucks can access them. At collection points, workers record names when possible, though many corpses are unidentifiable. The bodies are then loaded onto trucks for transport to cemeteries. Piskarovskoye Cemetery, on the northern edge of Leningrad, becomes the primary burial ground for the siege's victims. Before the war, it was a modest cemetery serving several parishes. Now it transforms into the largest mass burial site in human history. The cemetery workers face an impossible task, burying thousands of bodies per day in ground that remains frozen solid. The first graves are dug with explosives, blasting craters in the frozen earth, creating pits large enough to hold hundreds of bodies. Later, as the ground thaws, mechanical excavators dig trenches 40 meters long, 3 meters wide, 2 to 3 meters deep. The bodies are laid in these trenches in layers, sometimes wrapped in sheets if sheets are available, often unwrapped because there are not enough sheets in the city. The trenches are filled and covered with earth. Wooden markers indicate the grave number and the approximate count of bodies. The numbers are staggering. Grave number 5 contains 4,200 bodies. Grave number 17 contains 5,800. Grave number 23 contains 6,100. Between March and May 1942, the official count records 228,000 bodies collected and buried. This number is certainly an undercount. Many bodies were never reported, families burying their dead in gardens or parks, desperate people hiding deaths to continue collecting ration cards, corpses in collapsed buildings not discovered until demolition years later. Modern estimates suggest the true number of bodies from the first winter exceeds 500,000, with perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 never officially recorded. The cemetery itself will eventually hold more than 500,000 people in mass graves, making it the largest war cemetery in the world, though most graves contain not soldiers but civilians, not combatants, but victims of deliberate starvation. The cleanup extends beyond body collection to the entire infrastructure of the city. Water systems have frozen and burst, flooding basements and streets. Sewage systems have failed, creating health hazards. Electrical systems have collapsed, leaving most of the city without power. Buildings have been damaged by artillery and bombing. Windows are shattered throughout the city, replaced with cardboard or plywood if replaced at all. The cleanup brigades tackle these problems with desperate energy, working 12-hour days despite their weakness. They repair water pipes, using whatever materials are available. They clear rubble from bombed buildings. They restore tram lines, stringing new electrical cables, replacing tracks. The goal is not restoration to pre-war conditions, which is impossible, but restoration to basic functionality. April 15, 1942, 9 in the morning. A crowd gathers on Nevsky Prospect, several hundred people standing in the cold spring air, waiting, watching. The wait extends to 10, to 10:30, and then people begin to hear it. A mechanical grinding, the screech of metal wheels on rails, the hum of electric motors. Tram number 6 appears at the end of the street, moving slowly, the first tram to run in Leningrad since December. The crowd erupts, not in cheers, but in weeping. People cry openly, tears streaming down their gaunt faces, because the tram represents more than transportation. It represents the city's refusal to die, the assertion that life can continue, that normalcy might someday return. The tram stops and people crowd around it, touching it, not even trying to board, just needing to confirm it is real. The driver, a woman who lost her husband and 2 children during the winter, sits at the controls crying. The tram service will expand slowly over the following weeks, never reaching pre-war levels, but providing enough service to help the city function. May Day, 1942. Traditionally, the Great Soviet holiday celebrating workers and the Communist Party. In normal years, Leningrad would hold massive parades with hundreds of thousands of participants, banners, music, speeches. This year, the parade is different. Several thousand survivors, selected for being strong enough to march, gather on Palace Square, in front of the Winter Palace. They form ranks, wearing whatever clothing they have, many in civilian dress because military uniforms are reserved for the front. They carry red banners, but the silk is tattered, the poles are rough wood. At 10 in the morning, they begin to march, passing the reviewing stand where city officials salute. The marchers move slowly, some limping, others supported by comrades, but they march. They march to prove to themselves, to the Germans watching from beyond the siege lines, to the world, that Leningrad survives. That winter tried to kill them and failed. That spring has come to the graveyard and found it still inhabited by the living. The psychological impact of the cleanup and the restoration of services cannot be overstated. The winter had reduced Leningraders to pure survival, to animal existence, where thought extended no further than the next meal, the next hour. The spring cleanup forces people to think beyond immediate survival, to engage in collective action, to work toward a future that extends past today. The work is exhausting and traumatic. Handling corpses of neighbors, friends, family members takes an enormous psychological toll. But it is also cathartic, a way to process the horror, to reclaim agency, to do something active rather than passively waiting to die. The brigades develop fierce solidarity, women working together, forming bonds that will last lifetimes. They share tiny amounts of food, support each other when strength fails, mourn together when members of their brigade die. Out of the worst winter in human history, out of the work of cleaning up its aftermath, comes a kind of grim determination. The city will survive, not because survival is easy or even likely, but because the alternative is unacceptable. May ends with Leningrad still under siege, still cut off except for the supply route across Lake Ladoga, still under artillery bombardment and aerial attack. But the city has changed. The streets are clear. The trams run, at least some of them. The water supply functions, partially. People have enough food to survive, if not to thrive. Rations have increased to levels that prevent mass starvation, though hunger remains constant. Most importantly, Leningraders have proven to themselves that they can survive winter in a besieged city. They have learned to endure cold without fuel, to subsist on near-starvation rations, to keep functioning despite conditions that should have killed everyone. They have passed through the valley of death and emerged, diminished but alive, traumatized but determined. Spring has come to the graveyard, and the graveyard has come back to life, partially, tentatively, but undeniably. The siege will continue for nearly 2 more years, but never again will it reach the horror of that first winter. The city has survived its worst trial, and that survival becomes the foundation for everything that follows. September 9th, 1941, evening. Dmitry Shostakovich sits at his piano in his Leningrad apartment, surrounded by the chaos of early siege. Outside the window, fires burn across the city from the day's air raid. Artillery rumbles in the distance, a sound that has become constant background noise. Shostakovich's wife and children huddle in the next room, preparing for another night in the shelter. But Shostakovich is composing, writing furiously, notes spilling onto the manuscript paper in front of him. He is working on his 7th symphony, a piece that has been growing in his mind since the war began. The music he writes is fierce, militant, a musical representation of the invasion itself, a simple march theme that repeats and builds, becoming louder, more oppressive, more overwhelming, like the Nazi armies crushing everything before them. Shostakovich will call this movement the invasion, and it will become the most famous depiction of war ever written in musical form. Shostakovich is one of the Soviet Union's most celebrated composers, famous for symphonies that walk a dangerous line between official approval and artistic integrity. He has been denounced before, his works banned, his career threatened. But when war comes, his value to the state becomes clear. He can create propaganda more effective than any poster, music that stirs souls and steel hearts. The authorities want him to evacuate, to escape to safety, where he can continue composing. But Shostakovich refuses at first, insisting on staying with his city, joining the firefighting brigades that combat the incendiary bombs falling nightly. Photographs show him in firefighter's helmet, standing on the roof of the conservatory, watching for bombs. These images are reproduced in newspapers worldwide, showing Soviet cultural figures defending their city, and are worth divisions to the propaganda effort. October 9th, the authorities finally insist, and Shostakovich evacuates with his family, first to Moscow, then to Kuibyshev, far to the east. But he takes the unfinished symphony with him, and continues working through the autumn and winter. He completes it on December 27th, as Leningrad endures its worst suffering. The premiere takes place in Kuibyshev on March 5th, 1942, and the symphony is immediately recognized as a masterwork, a statement of defiance and suffering and determination. The Soviet authorities arrange for the score to be microfilmed and flown to Leningrad. The film is developed, printed, and distributed to musicians. Karl Eliasberg, conductor of the Leningrad Radio Orchestra, receives the score and realizes he has been given an impossible task: perform this symphony in a besieged, starving city. The symphony requires a full orchestra, 80 musicians minimum. Eliasberg's orchestra before the war numbered 100 musicians. But by March 1942, only 15 remain alive and in the city, and most of them are too weak from starvation to play. Eliasberg, himself gaunt and weak, begins a search for musicians. He places advertisements on the radio. Attention all musicians. Report to the radio orchestra for urgent duty. Soldiers who were musicians before the war are pulled from frontline units. Music teachers, conservatory students, anyone who can play an instrument is recruited. Slowly, desperately, Eliasberg assembles an orchestra. But the musicians are starving, many suffering from dystrophy, barely able to hold their instruments. The first rehearsal is chaos. Musicians collapse, Others cannot produce sound from their instruments. The music falls apart within minutes. Eliasberg realizes that before they can play the symphony, he must help them survive. The orchestra members receive special rations, slightly increased food allocations justified by their status as essential workers for propaganda purposes. This is controversial. Why should musicians get extra food when soldiers and workers are starving? But the authorities approve it because Stalin himself has learned of the performance and wants it to succeed. The musicians slowly regain strength over months, not to health, but to functionality. They rehearse in unheated rooms, wearing gloves with the fingers cut off so they can reach the keys and strings. They rehearse while artillery shells fall nearby. They rehearse while air raid sirens wail. The music is extraordinarily difficult, Shostakovich at his most ambitious, requiring technical precision and emotional depth. The musicians are playing while half dead, but they play August 9th, 1942, 7 in the evening. Philharmonic Hall, in the city center, has been prepared for the performance. The audience consists of survivors, soldiers on leave from the front lines, factory workers, officials, anyone strong enough to attend. The hall is damaged, windows blown out, covered with plywood. The temperature is comfortable by siege standards, merely cool rather than freezing. As 7 approaches, the audience falls silent. Eliasberg takes the podium, gaunt as a skeleton, wearing a suit that hangs loose on his wasted frame. He raises his baton. The orchestra, 80 musicians assembled from the ruins, begins to play. The music starts quietly, almost peaceful, representing life before the invasion. Then comes the invasion theme, that relentless march growing louder and louder, overwhelming everything. The audience sits transfixed, hearing their own experience transformed into sound. Outside the hall, throughout the city, loudspeakers broadcast the performance. The music echoes through streets, still scarred by winter's death. It blares across the front lines, carried by speakers pointed toward German positions so that the enemy can hear it. And in the German lines, soldiers and officers listen, hearing this impossible thing, a symphony, performed in a city they have been trying to destroy for 11 months, played by an orchestra assembled from people who should be dead. A German artillery officer will write in his diary that night, "We realized they would never surrender. This music made us understand we had lost, even if we won battles." Whether this quote is authentic or apocryphal, it captures the truth. The performance is a victory more complete than any military triumph. The symphony lasts 80 minutes, longer than any other major work of the war era. The musicians push through exhaustion, some nearly collapsing but continuing. The audience weeps openly during the third movement, the requiem for those who have died. The final movement builds to a triumphant conclusion, asserting that, despite everything, life continues, the city survives, the culture endures. When the music ends, the audience sits in stunned silence for several seconds, then erupts in applause that continues for minutes, people standing despite their weakness, clapping until their hands hurt, crying and applauding simultaneously. Eliasberg takes his bow, tears streaming down his face. The orchestra stands, supporting each other. 3 of the musicians will die in the months following the performance, their bodies unable to recover from the strain. Several others will survive but never play again, the dystrophy having permanently damaged their nerves and muscles. The performance is broadcast internationally via shortwave radio, reaching audiences in Britain, America, and around the world. It becomes one of the defining cultural moments of World War II, proof that civilization can survive barbarism, that art matters even when people are starving, that human creativity is indestructible. The symphony will be performed more than 60 times in the Soviet Union during the war, and premieres in London and America, becoming the most famous musical work of the war. Shostakovich becomes an international celebrity, his image used to rally support for the Soviet Union and the Allied cause. But the real heroes are the musicians in Leningrad who performed it first, who played a symphony while dying, who proved that culture is not a luxury but a necessity, that humans need beauty and meaning as much as they need bread and water. The performance changes something in the city's psychology. It demonstrates that Leningrad is not merely surviving but living, not merely enduring but creating. The siege will continue for another year and a half. The shelling and bombing and suffering will go on, But after the symphony, there is a subtle shift in how Leningraders think about their situation. They are not just victims waiting for rescue. They are defenders of something worth defending, preservers of culture, representatives of civilization against barbarism. The symphony gives meaning to the suffering, transforms the siege from meaningless tragedy into purposeful resistance. This is perhaps art's highest function, not to entertain or decorate, but to remind humans of their humanity when everything conspires to reduce them to animals. In the ruins of Leningrad, in a hall with broken windows, an orchestra of half-dead musicians played a symphony, and in doing so, won a victory more profound than any battlefield triumph. December 10th, 1942, Soviet military headquarters south of Lake Ladoga. General Leonid Govorov, recently appointed commander of the Leningrad Front, spreads maps across a table and explains Operation Iskra, Operation Spark, to his staff. The plan is straightforward in concept, but murderously difficult in execution. Launch simultaneous offensives from inside the Leningrad pocket and from the Soviet lines east of the siege ring, breaking through German defenses at their narrowest point south of Lake Ladoga, establishing a land corridor to the city. The distance to be covered is only 10 to 15 kilometers, but those kilometers are held by elite German divisions in heavily fortified positions. Govorov has convinced Stalin to allocate massive resources to the operation: 302,000 troops, 4,900 artillery pieces, 600 tanks. The attack will use every lesson learned in 2 years of bitter warfare. It will begin in January 1943, and it will break the siege, or it will fail catastrophically. There is no middle ground. The German positions south of Lake Ladoga represent 2 years of military engineering. The German 227th Infantry Division holds Schlisselburg and the corridor, supported by heavy artillery and positioned behind 3 defensive lines. The first line consists of entrenchments, machine gun nests, and barbed wire. The second line adds anti-tank ditches, bunkers, and minefields. The third line includes fortified villages, with houses converted into strongpoints, every building a potential fortress. Between the lines lie fields of fire cleared by cutting down forests, ensuring attackers must cross open ground under observation. German artillery pre-sights every approach, ready to deliver devastating fire on any assault. The defenses are formidable, but they have a weakness. They are not infinitely deep. Break through all 3 lines, and there is nothing behind them but supply lines and rear area troops. January 12th, 1943, 9:30 in the morning. The Soviet artillery opens fire, 4,900 guns firing simultaneously in the largest artillery barrage yet seen on the Eastern Front. The sound is beyond description, a physical force that shakes the ground kilometers away, that shatters windows in Leningrad 20 kilometers distant, that leaves Soviet observers temporarily deaf, even with protection. The barrage lasts 2 hours, pulverizing German positions, cutting wire, destroying bunkers, severing communication lines. German soldiers huddle in their deepest shelters, waiting for the steel storm to pass, knowing the infantry assault will follow immediately. At 11:30, the barrage shifts to a rolling pattern, moving forward in stages, and Soviet infantry attacks across the frozen Neva River and from the eastern positions. The battle for the corridor has begun. The fighting is savage, close-quarters combat in frozen trenches and ruined villages. Soviet troops advance against fierce resistance, taking casualties that would have stopped earlier offensives, but pressing forward because this time the stakes are understood. This time failure means Leningrad dies. German defenders fight with equal desperation because they know a breakthrough dooms the entire Army Group North position. The battle seesaws, villages changing hands multiple times, both sides feeding in reserves, casualties mounting into tens of thousands. Soviet commanders throw fresh divisions into sectors where the German lines show weakness, accepting horrific losses to maintain momentum. The advance measures in meters per day initially, then tens of meters, then hundreds, the German lines buckling under unsustainable pressure. January 18th, early morning. Soviet pincers from east and west meet at Workers' Settlement No. 5, south of Lake Ladoga. The connection is made. Soldiers from the Leningrad Front and the Volkhov Front embrace, weeping, firing their weapons in the air in celebration. The The siege ring is broken. The city has a land corridor to Soviet-held territory, a corridor 10 to 12 kilometers wide, enough to construct a railway and a road. The cost has been immense. 76,000 Soviet soldiers killed or wounded in 7 days, one of the highest casualty rates of the war. The Germans suffer 36,000 casualties, losses they can barely afford. But the corridor exists, and through it, supplies can flow. The corridor, however, is no safe highway. The Germans still hold the high ground at Sinyavino Heights, looking down into the corridor from elevated positions. German artillery observers can see everything moving through the corridor, can call down fire on any vehicle, any column of troops. The Soviets name it the Corridor of Death, and the name is earned. Construction crews work to build a railway through the corridor, laying track under constant bombardment, suffering daily casualties. Workers wear helmets constantly, and still the shells find them. Trains that will use the railway must travel at maximum speed through the corridor, hoping to pass the danger zone before German artillery finds them. Many trains are hit, derailing, burning, spilling cargo and corpses. But supplies get through. Food, ammunition, fuel, reinforcements, all the material that could not be brought across Lake Ladoga in sufficient quantities now arrives by rail. February 7th, 1943, afternoon. The first through train arrives in Leningrad from mainland Soviet territory, carrying flour and grain. It has traveled through the corridor at 70 kilometers per hour, German shells bracketing it but missing, arriving miraculously intact. The population greets it as a miracle, crowding the railway stations to see the train, to touch it, to confirm that the city is no longer completely isolated. Food rations increase immediately, not to pre-war levels, but to levels where starvation becomes unlikely for healthy adults. Workers receive 500 grams of bread per day, up from 300. Others receive 300 grams, up from 200. These increases sound small, but they represent the difference between slow starvation and survival. Deaths from hunger drop dramatically within weeks. The corridor transforms the siege from mortal emergency to long-term hardship. The city is still under siege, still surrounded on 3 sides, still subject to artillery bombardment and air raids. But the existential threat has passed. Leningrad will not starve to death. Factories can operate more consistently with improved supply of raw materials and fuel. The population can be maintained at survival levels. Wounded soldiers can be evacuated to hospitals outside the city. The psychological impact is profound. Leningraders begin to believe they will survive, that the siege will end eventually, that life might someday return to normal. This belief matters because it enables planning beyond immediate survival, investment in futures that extend past next week. Spring and summer of 1943 pass with the city in a strange limbo, better supplied than during the first winter, but still under siege, still dying from shells and bombs, still losing hundreds of civilians each month. The front lines shift slightly, local attacks and counterattacks gaining or losing a few kilometers, but the basic situation remains stable. The Germans cannot break into the city without losses they are unwilling to accept, losses that would cripple Army Group North and open the entire northern front to Soviet counteroffensive. The Soviets cannot push the Germans far enough back to end the artillery bombardment without an offensive larger than they can currently mount, given priority to operations around Moscow and Stalingrad. So the siege continues in this reduced but still deadly form, a bleeding wound that weakens both sides, a strategic stalemate that favors the Soviets because time is on their side, because the corridor allows them to outlast their enemy. The corridor will remain open, under constant German fire but functional, for the rest of the siege. It saves Leningrad. The city that would have died without it survives, barely, expensively, but undeniably. The ice road had been temporary salvation, functioning only in winter. The corridor is permanent salvation, functioning year-round, immune to weather. It is not relief from siege, but relief from death sentence, changing the question from, will Leningrad survive? To, when will Leningrad be liberated? That change in question marks the turning point of the siege, the moment when survival becomes not just possible, but probable, when the city's defenders can see a future beyond siege, beyond war, beyond suffering. The noose has loosened, Not enough to remove, but enough to breathe, and breathing is enough for now. The city will wait, will endure, will survive, and someday, the noose will be cut entirely. But that day is still more than a year away, and in the meantime, the dying continues, slower but unceasing, the siege grinding on. June 4th, 1943, 3 in the afternoon. Nevsky Prospect is busier than it has been in 2 years. Trams run regularly now, though not on pre-war schedules. People walk with less of the shuffling gait that marked the Starvation winters, moving with something approaching normal energy. Shops are open, though with minimal goods for sale. A queue forms outside a bakery, people waiting patiently for their ration bread. The scene looks almost normal until you notice the details. Everyone is too thin, wearing clothes that hang loose, faces gaunt and aged beyond their years. The buildings are scarred with shrapnel, windows still broken in many structures. And every few minutes, the sound that has defined life for 2 years. The whistle of incoming artillery, followed by the crump of explosion somewhere in the city. Everyone flinches, looks toward the sound, evaluates the distance, then continues what they were doing. This is normal now. The siege continues. The corridor opened in January has transformed Leningrad's situation from desperate to merely terrible. Food arrives in quantities sufficient to prevent mass starvation. Rations in summer 1943 provide 1,200 to 1,500 calories per day, enough for survival, though not abundance. Hunger remains constant, bodies remain undernourished, but the immediate threat of death from starvation has receded for most. The improvement is relative. Compare these rations to peacetime, and they represent severe deprivation. Compare them to winter 1941, and they represent luxury. Leningraders live in this strange middle ground, not dying, but not truly living, existing in a prolonged state of hardship that tests endurance in different ways than acute crisis. The German artillery and air force ensure that survival does not mean safety. The Germans, unable to break into the city, settle into a campaign of terrorization, systematically targeting civilians to break morale and kill indiscriminately. Artillery observers identify high-traffic areas and schedule bombardments to maximize casualties. They shell Nevsky Prospect during afternoon shopping hours. They shell tram stops during morning and evening commutes. They shell bread lines forming outside bakeries. They shell factory shifts changing. The shelling is not random, but calculated, an attempt to kill as many people as possible while expending minimum ammunition. The Luftwaffe continues bombing raids, targeting residential areas as often as military or industrial targets. Life in Leningrad becomes a morbid lottery where survival depends partly on caution and partly on chance. A Mother's Diary, September 3, 1943, captures the randomness. We have enough food now, thank God. Katya is stronger, back to school, doing well in her classes. Today, she left for school at 8 in the morning, walking the route she walks every day. At 8:45, a shell hit the tram stop, where she would have been if the tram had been on time. 6 people killed. But the tram was late, so Katya was still walking. She is alive because of a 5-minute delay. How do I make sense of this? How do I let her leave tomorrow, knowing that any moment might be the moment? I cannot keep her home. Life must continue. But I would trade all the food in the city for peace, for the shells to stop, for one day without fear. The authorities implement systems to minimize casualties. Air raid sirens sound when German bombers are detected approaching, giving people time to reach shelters. A metronome is broadcast on the radio continuously. It beats slowly during normal conditions, accelerates to rapid ticks during air raids, returns to slow when the all-clear sounds. The metronome becomes the heartbeat of the city, survivors remembering its sound for the rest of their lives. Notices are posted identifying which sides of streets are most dangerous. The side exposed to German artillery gets a painted warning. Citizens, during artillery bombardment, this side of the street is most dangerous. People learn to walk on the safe side, though safety is relative when shells can strike anywhere. Children adapt to siege conditions in ways that disturb their parents. They play games incorporating air raids and shelling, games with names like bombardment and shelter. They collect shrapnel as toys, trading pieces like pre-war children traded cards. They become expert at distinguishing the sounds of different weapons. The whistle of howitzer shells, the scream of dive bombers, the crackle of anti-aircraft fire. A teacher reports, "The children are calm during raids. Too calm. They no longer cry or panic. They file into shelters efficiently, continue their lessons underground, emerge when the all-clear sounds and resume play. This calmness worries me more than panic would. They are too young to be so accepting of death." The factories continue operating, producing ammunition, weapons, and supplies for the Red Army. Workers labor 12-hour shifts in buildings with broken windows, without adequate heating in winter, without safety equipment. Industrial accidents are common, workers too weak or distracted to maintain proper caution. But production continues because stopping production means the front collapses, means the Germans break through, means everything endured has been for nothing. Leningrad's factories produce thousands of artillery pieces, hundreds of thousands of shells, tens of thousands of rifles. The city is simultaneously victim and arsenal, suffering under siege while supplying the forces that will eventually break it. The cultural life of the city continues in diminished form. Theaters operate, presenting plays to audiences of hundreds rather than thousands. The Philharmonic gives concerts, though with reduced orchestra. The ballet performs, dancers too thin to complete the most demanding choreography, but performing what they can. Libraries remain open, readers studying in rooms where breath condenses in winter. This persistence of culture is partly propaganda. The authorities want to demonstrate that Leningrad remains civilized, unbeaten, but also genuine need. People require something beyond mere survival, need to engage with beauty and meaning to remain human. The audiences at concerts and theaters are skeletal, dressed in rags, sitting in freezing halls. But they come, they listen, they applaud, asserting that life consists of more than bread and shelter. The second winter under siege, 1943-44, is vastly better than the first, but still harsh. Food supplies are adequate to prevent mass starvation, but cold remains a problem. Fuel is scarce, heating minimal, temperatures in apartments often below freezing. People burn furniture, books, anything combustible to create minimal warmth. Deaths from cold and disease continue, though at rates 10% of the first winter. The population has adapted, learning survival strategies, understanding how to conserve energy, how to protect themselves from cold, how to identify early signs of illness. This adaptation is remarkable, but tragic humans should not have to become expert at surviving siege conditions, should not have to learn these lessons through losing hundreds of thousands of neighbors. By spring 1944, Leningraders have been under siege for 900 days, 2.5 years. The city's population has declined from 3.2 million to perhaps 800,000 civilians plus military forces, a loss of 75%, some evacuated but most dead. The survivors are hard in ways impossible to explain to those who have not experienced similar trauma. They have watched families die, have burned furniture to survive cold, have eaten things no human should eat, have worked through exhaustion and hunger, have lived daily with the possibility of sudden death from shells or bombs. They do not complain much. Complaining achieves nothing. They do not hope much. Hope has proven a cruel emotion that prolongs suffering. They endure, day after day, month after month, not because endurance is noble, but because endurance is all that remains. The long wait continues, not knowing when or how it will end, knowing only that it must end eventually, because nothing lasts forever, not even the Siege of Leningrad. But eventually feels like another lifetime, another world, as far away as peace once seemed when the Germans first closed the ring in 1941. November 1943. Leningrad Hospital Psychiatric Ward, Doctor. Maria Konnikova sits across from a patient, a woman in her 30s who looks 60, recording notes as the woman speaks in a monotone voice that barely qualifies as speech. "I cannot throw food away. Even spoiled food, moldy bread, rotten vegetables. I see them, and I must keep them, must save them, because what if there is nothing tomorrow? My husband tries to throw away moldy bread, and I scream at him. I attack him. I cannot control myself. I know the war continues. I know we have food now, but my mind will not accept this. Every meal might be the last. Every crumb is precious. I dream of bread every night, wake up reaching for it, finding nothing." Doctor. Konnikova has heard variations of this story hundreds of times. She is documenting a new psychiatric condition, one with no name yet, but one that will affect siege survivors for the rest of their lives. The siege creates psychological damage on a scale unprecedented in medical history. The first winter's mass starvation leaves physical scars, damaged organs, weakened hearts, digestive systems that never fully recover, but the psychological damage is deeper and longer lasting. Soviet psychiatrists in Leningrad begin systematic study of siege survivors, even while the siege continues, documenting symptoms, attempting treatment, realizing they are witnessing something new. The closest comparable situation is concentration camp survivors, but concentration camps affect thousands, while the siege affects hundreds of thousands. The sheer scale of trauma creates a collective condition, a shared pathology that will be called blockadnaya bolezen, blockade disease, though it encompasses dozens of specific symptoms and syndromes. The documented symptoms fall into recognizable patterns. Food obsession. Survivors cannot stop thinking about food, dreaming about food, talking about food, even when food is available. They hoard food compulsively, hiding bread in closets, under beds, in pockets, unable to trust that supply will continue. They cannot waste food, eating everything on their plates even when full, eating food that has spoiled rather than discarding it, becoming distressed when others waste food. Weight and body image disorders. Survivors remain constantly aware of their weight and others' weight, evaluating emaciation as recently as last week, commenting on who has lost or gained weight, equating thinness with death even years later. Survivors often cannot gain weight back even with adequate food, their bodies seeming unable to remember how to store fat. Emotional numbing and dissociation appear in most survivors. The capacity to feel normal emotions becomes damaged, as if the extremity of siege suffering burned out emotional responsiveness. Survivors report feeling disconnected from their own lives, watching themselves from outside, unable to engage emotionally with events that should matter. They attend family celebrations feeling nothing. They receive news of loved ones' deaths with indifference. They go through motions of normal life, work, relationships, daily routines, while feeling empty inside. Dr. Konnikova notes, "It is as if they left part of themselves in the siege winter, the part that feels and hopes and cares, and only their bodies survived. They are ghosts of themselves." Survivor guilt manifests universally among those who lived while family members died. The guilt takes multiple forms. Why did I survive when my children died? Should I have given them more of my ration? Could I have done something different? The guilt is often irrational in many cases. Survivors did everything possible, but rationality does not ease it. Survivors torture themselves with alternatives that did not exist, with choices that were not really choices, with the fundamental injustice that survival often came down to chance rather than merit. A woman tells Dr. Konnikova, "My son was 8 years old. He did nothing wrong. He deserved to live. I was 35. I had lived. Why did I survive and he die? I gave him most of my food. I did everything, but it was not enough. Every day I am alive is a day he should have lived instead." The relationship with memory becomes complicated for survivors. Some cannot stop remembering, experiencing intrusive flashbacks triggered by sensory cues. The smell of burning sugar recalls the Badaya fire. Cold weather triggers memories of frozen corpses. The sound of planes causes panic. Others cannot remember, have blocked out months or years of siege experience, recall only fragments, have erected psychological walls against memories too painful to process. Both patterns are coping mechanisms, neither entirely healthy. The flashback sufferers cannot escape the past. The memory blockers cannot integrate their experience, leaving gaps in their identity, parts of themselves left behind in time periods they cannot access. Children who survive the siege show particularly severe long-term effects. Those who were young children during the worst winters grow up with developmental delays, learning difficulties, emotional problems. They missed years of normal childhood development, years when brains and bodies should have been growing rapidly, but instead were barely surviving. These children, now adults, carry the siege in their stunted growth, their damaged organs, their psychological scars. Those who were teenagers during the siege often display what modern psychology would call complex PTSD, difficulty with relationships, inability to trust, hypervigilance, emotional volatility. They were old enough to understand what was happening, but too young to have developed adult coping mechanisms, experiencing trauma at the worst possible developmental stage. Post-war, Soviet authorities actively suppressed discussion of psychological damage, considering it weakness, defeatism, improper focus on suffering rather than heroism. Survivors are expected to return to normal life, to work, to rebuild, to not complain. This suppression prevents treatment, prevents even acknowledgement that something is wrong. Survivors who seek psychiatric help are often viewed with suspicion. Why are they weak when others are strong? Veterans and siege survivors with psychological symptoms may be denied jobs, denied housing, investigated by the NKVD for possible disloyalty. The message is clear. You survived, that should be enough, now be quiet and work. This enforced silence compounds the trauma, preventing processing, forcing survivors to carry their damage alone. The physiological effects of starvation prove permanent in many cases. Survivors develop cardiovascular disease at rates 40% higher than non-siege populations, their hearts damaged by months of severe malnutrition. Digestive systems never fully recover. Many survivors suffering chronic stomach problems, unable to properly digest food even when available. The endocrine system is affected. Women who survive the siege often experiencing early menopause, fertility problems, difficult pregnancies. Accelerated aging is universal. Survivors' bodies are physiologically 10 to 15 years older than their chronological age. Cellular damage from starvation proving irreversible. Life expectancy for siege survivors averages 12 to 15 years shorter than comparable populations. But amid the damage, some survivors demonstrate remarkable resilience. They rebuild lives, form families, find meaning in work and relationships. They develop what modern psychology calls post-traumatic growth, a deepened appreciation for life, a clear sense of priorities, an understanding of what matters. They become intolerant of triviality, impatient with complaints about minor inconveniences, focused on essentials. A survivor reflects, after the siege, nothing frightens me. Lost job? I have been hungry before. Relationship ends? I have lost family before. Financial problems? I have had nothing before. The siege taught me that humans can survive almost anything, that life is precious not because it is easy, but because it is temporary. I do not waste time on small worries. I have seen real suffering, and this is not it. This perspective, born of trauma, becomes a kind of wisdom, hard-earned and unshakable, the gift extracted from catastrophe. The psychology of encirclement leaves permanent damage, but for some, it also leaves permanent strength, a core of resilience forged in conditions that would have broken most humans. The survivors carry both the damage and the strength, inseparable for the rest of their lives. January 14th, 1944, 9 in the morning. The Soviet artillery preparation begins with a sound that shakes the frozen earth. 220,000 shells fired in 65 minutes, the most concentrated bombardment in the history of warfare to this point. The shells arc over the siege lines, falling on German positions 20 kilometers south of Leningrad, pulverizing trenches, destroying bunkers, severing communications, creating a wall of fire and steel that moves like a living thing across the German defensive positions. Inside Leningrad, 20 kilometers away, the ground trembles. Windows rattle in their frames. People stop on streets, listening, realizing what the sound means. The final offensive has begun. After 872 days, after nearly 2.5 years, after more suffering than any city in human history, Leningrad's liberation is starting. The Soviet plan is massive in scope and methodical in execution. 4 separate but coordinated offensives will strike German Army Group North across a 300-kilometer front, from Leningrad south to Novgorod, designed to shatter German defensive lines and force a general retreat. The Leningrad Front, commanded by General Leonid Govorov, will attack from the Iranian bomb bridgehead and from positions around the city, driving south and southwest to push the Germans away from Leningrad itself. The Volkhov Front, commanded by General Kirill Meretskov, will attack from the east, threatening German rear areas and supply lines. Simultaneously, other Soviet forces will strike toward Novgorod, a critical German strongpoint, to unhinge the entire Army Group North defensive system. The forces assembled represent one of the largest concentrations of Soviet military power: 1,240,000 troops, 20,000 artillery pieces, 1,500 tanks and self-propelled guns, 1,400 aircraft. The German defenders, Army Group North under Field Marshal Georg von Küchler, number 741,000 men in 30 divisions. But they are overstretched, undersupplied, exhausted by 2.5 years of siege warfare. The German defenses remain formidable: multiple defensive lines, extensive minefields, prepared positions, interlocking fields of fire, but the defenders lack the reserves to counter a breakthrough, lack the mobility to respond to multiple simultaneous threats, lack the air support to contest Soviet air superiority. Hitler has forbidden any retreat, demanding that Army Group North hold every meter of ground, but Hitler's orders cannot change mathematics. The Soviets have overwhelming superiority in numbers, equipment, and operational initiative. The first day achieves limited penetration. Soviet troops attack across frozen ground into intense German fire, taking heavy casualties but pushing forward through the outer defensive lines. The attack from the Oranienbaum bridgehead achieves the deepest penetration, breaking through the first German line and advancing 4 kilometers. German commanders frantically call for reinforcements, but reinforcements are not available. The reserves that might have sealed the breakthrough are deployed elsewhere or do not exist. By nightfall, Soviet forces have created multiple penetrations in the German lines, narrow wedges driven into the defensive system, not yet a breakthrough, but clearly the beginning of collapse. January 17th, the critical day. Soviet forces storm Sinyavino Heights, the high ground overlooking the corridor of death, ground the Germans have held since September 1941. The battle for the heights is vicious: hand-to-hand combat in trenches and bunkers, Soviet troops advancing under heavy fire, accepting catastrophic casualties to maintain momentum. The Germans defend desperately, knowing that losing the heights means losing observation over the corridor, means losing the ability to interdict Soviet supplies, means losing the linchpin of the entire siege position. But desperation is not enough. By evening, Soviet flags fly over the heights. The German position is broken. The corridor is secure. The siege is effectively over, though fighting will continue for days. January 20th, Novgorod falls. This ancient Russian city, 180 kilometers south of Leningrad, has been occupied by the Germans since August 1941. Its liberation threatens the entire German position, exposing Army Group North to encirclement if it does not retreat. Von Küchler requests permission to withdraw to defensive lines further west, to save his army from destruction. Hitler refuses initially, then reluctantly grants permission on January 21st. But the permission comes too late. The Soviet offensive has gained momentum that cannot be stopped. German forces retreat in some sectors, attempt to hold in others, lose coherence as Soviet breakthroughs disrupt command and control. The retreat becomes a rout in some areas, orderly withdrawal in others, but everywhere the Germans are falling back, abandoning positions held for years. January 27th, 1944, 8 in the evening. Radio Leningrad broadcasts an announcement. The blockade of Leningrad has been completely lifted. The city is free. Simultaneously, the traditional Russian victory salute sounds: 24 artillery salvos, 324 guns firing in synchronization, the sound echoing across the city. These are not shells falling, but shells celebrating. The sound of artillery transformed from weapon to instrument of joy. The population erupts. People pour into the streets despite the cold, despite the darkness, despite exhaustion. Strangers embrace, weeping, laughing, unable to believe it is real. On Nevsky Prospect, crowds gather, thousands of people spontaneously assembling, standing together in silence, broken by sobbing, the weight of 872 days crashing down all at once. The emotional response is complex, not simple joy, but a mixture of relief, grief, disbelief, exhaustion. A survivor describes the moment: "I stood on the street crying, but I did not know if I was crying from happiness or sadness. The siege was over, we had survived, but so many had not survived. My parents, my brother, my daughter, all dead. I was free, but alone. Everyone around me was crying. Everyone was together, but I felt completely isolated, surrounded by ghosts. The city was liberated, but the dead were still dead, and liberation could not bring them back. This mixture of triumph and trauma characterizes Leningrad's liberation, a victory that costs too much to celebrate without reservation. The German retreat continues through February, Soviet forces pursuing, liberating towns and villages occupied for years, pushing the front lines back 100 to 200 kilometers from Leningrad. The immediate threat to the city ends. The artillery bombardment stops. The air raids stop. For the first time in 872 days, civilians can walk streets without fear of sudden death from shelling, can sleep without air raid sirens, can live without the constant background threat of violence. The psychological impact is immediate and disorienting. People accustomed to constant danger suddenly have safety. Accustomed to restriction suddenly have freedom. Accustomed to siege suddenly have normalcy. The adjustment proves difficult. Many survivors report feeling lost, purposeless, uncertain what to do with lives no longer organized around survival. The military cost of the liberation is severe but acceptable by Soviet standards. 76,000 Soviet soldiers killed, 237,000 wounded in the January offensive. These numbers represent 14 days of combat. The German losses are lighter in absolute terms, 60,000 killed or captured, but represent a larger proportion of available forces and, more importantly, represent strategic defeat. Army Group North retreats to defensive lines in the Baltic states, abandoning all of the Leningrad region, losing the strategic position it has held since autumn 1941. The siege that was supposed to destroy Leningrad instead becomes a millstone around Germany's neck, tying down forces desperately needed elsewhere, consuming resources, achieving nothing except to demonstrate that Soviet determination exceeds German capability. The night of January 27th, Leningraders gather in apartment buildings, in factories, in hospitals, listening to the victory announcement on the radio, hearing the artillery salute, trying to process what has happened. A child asks her mother, "Does this mean Papa can come home?" The mother has to explain that Papa died 2 winters ago, that the siege ending does not bring back the dead, that victory means only that the dying has stopped. The child does not understand. The adults barely understand. The siege has been the defining reality of life for so long that its absence creates a void, a vacuum where constant threat used to be. Filling that void, learning to live without siege, rebuilding lives and city, will take years, decades, generations. But on this night, January 27th, 1944, the siege is over. Leningrad has survived. The city that Hitler swore to erase from the earth stands battered, scarred, diminished, but standing. The final casualty count is not yet known, will never be known precisely, but exceeds 1 million dead. The final assessment of what the siege means, what it accomplished, what it cost, will be debated by historians for the rest of human history. But the simple fact, the fundamental truth, is that Leningrad survived 872 days of siege, and that survival, bought with more blood than any city should have to pay, represents one of the most remarkable achievements and most terrible tragedies of World War II. February 10th, 1944, 3 weeks after liberation, a Soviet commission enters a building in Leningrad that has not been opened since winter 1941. The building is a communal apartment block, 6 stories, 48 units, designed to house approximately 200 people. The commission is tasked with establishing an accurate death toll from the siege, apartment by apartment, block by block, district by district. They carry clipboards, forms, pencils. They knock on the first apartment door. No answer. They open the door locks mean nothing to official commissions and find a frozen tableau. 3 bodies in beds, an elderly couple, and an adult son, all dead, covered by every piece of fabric in the apartment. The commission records the names from identity papers, marks the address, moves to the next apartment. By the end of the day, they will have processed the entire building. 41 apartments occupied at the start of siege, 173 residents recorded, 92 confirmed dead, 47 evacuated, 34 current residents. These numbers, multiplied across thousands of buildings, will determine the official death toll, and the official death toll will become one of the most contested statistics in history. The Soviet authorities approach the death count with political considerations that override accuracy. Stalin's government needs a number that demonstrates German barbarity without demonstrating Soviet incompetence. Too low, a number minimizes German crimes. Too high, a number raises questions about why the Soviet leadership allowed such casualties, why evacuation was not completed, why the city was not better supplied. The Commission therefore operates under unstated but understood constraints. Count deaths that can be clearly attributed to enemy action, minimize deaths that might be attributed to Soviet policy failures, find a number that serves propaganda purposes while remaining plausibly accurate. These constraints doom the count to inadequacy from the beginning. The official count, published in 1945, claims 632,000 deaths in Leningrad during the siege. This number quickly becomes enshrined in Soviet historiography, repeated in books and articles and commemorations, treated as established fact. But researchers examining the data immediately identify problems. The count relies heavily on burial records from Piskarovskoye and Serafimovskoye cemeteries, which record approximately 500,000 burials. But many deaths were never registered: families burying dead in gardens, people dying alone in apartments and not discovered for months, bodies lost in collapsed buildings. The count does not adequately include military casualties, which were reported separately and inconsistently. The count does not include evacuees who died during evacuation or shortly after, deaths that occurred because of siege conditions but outside the official siege zone. In the 1960s, Soviet historians led by Dmitry Pavlov and Vladimir Janiskevich begin reassessing the death toll using multiple data sources: ration card records, housing registries, factory employment rolls, school enrollment records, utility connection records. Each source provides a different perspective on population change. Ration card records show approximately 2.5 million cards issued in September 1941, declining to approximately 800,000 by January 1944. Some of this decline is evacuation, but evacuation records account for only 900,000 people. The remaining 1.7 million decline represents deaths. Similar calculations using other sources produce numbers in the range of 800,000 to 1,100,000 civilian deaths, significantly higher than the official count. The military casualties add another layer of complexity. The Leningrad Front and Baltic Fleet lost approximately 350,000, killed in action, and 100,000 missing, presumed dead. But these numbers include casualties from offensive operations outside the city as well as defensive operations within the siege perimeter. How many of these deaths should be attributed to the siege versus normal military operations? The answer depends on how siege is defined. If siege means only casualties within the encirclement, the number is lower. If siege means all casualties suffered by forces defending Leningrad or attempting to break the siege, the number is much higher. Soviet military record-keeping, deliberately obscured to prevent enemies from assessing combat effectiveness, makes precise calculation impossible. Modern historians, working with access to archives opened after the Soviet Union's collapse, have refined the estimates but not resolved the uncertainty. The consensus range is 1 million to 1.5 million total deaths attributable to the siege, 800,000 to 1,100,000 civilian deaths, 300,000 to 400,000 military deaths. But even these numbers carry caveats. What about people who survived the siege but died in 1944 or 1945 from siege-related health damage? What about children born during the siege who died in infancy from malnutrition-related causes? What about the reduced birth rate during the siege? Should the children never born be counted as demographic losses? The deeper you examine the question, the more complex it becomes. The uncertainty about the death toll creates moral and historical problems. How do you memorialize deaths you cannot count? How do you assign responsibility when the numbers are uncertain? The Nazis planned the siege as a method of extermination, making them morally responsible for all deaths. But Soviet leadership decisions, refusing early evacuation, diverting supplies to military rather than civilian use, maintaining the city as a military objective, rather than declaring it an open city, contributed to the death toll. If the real number is 1 million dead versus the official 632,000, that discrepancy of 370,000 people represents a quantity of suffering that was suppressed, forgotten, written out of history. These are not abstract statistics, but individuals who died, families who were destroyed, whose deaths were not even properly counted. The comparison to other disasters puts Leningrad's losses in perspective, while simultaneously making them incomprehensible. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki together killed approximately 200,000 people, a catastrophe that changed world history. Leningrad's siege killed 5 to 7 times as many people over a longer period. The bombing of Dresden killed 25,000 people, remembered as one of the war's great atrocities. Leningrad lost 40 times as many. The siege killed more people than Britain lost in the entire war, more than the United States lost in the entire war, possibly more than all Anglo-American losses in World War II combined. This is not to diminish other tragedies, but to emphasize the scale of Leningrad's catastrophe, a scale so large it becomes difficult for the human mind to grasp. Piskarovskoye Cemetery stands as physical evidence of the death toll, even if the exact count remains uncertain. The cemetery contains mass graves stretching across 186 hectares, with a memorial complex erected in 1960. The memorial features a statue of Mother Russia holding a wreath, flanked by walls listing dates of mass burials. The inscription, written by poet Olga Bergholz, a siege survivor, reads, "No one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten." But this assertion is precisely what the uncertain death toll contradicts. Hundreds of thousands are forgotten, their names never recorded, their graves unmarked, their existence reduced to statistical uncertainty. The cemetery holds perhaps 500,000 bodies in mass graves, but even this is estimate, not certainty, because the graves were dug in chaos, records were incomplete, and some bodies were buried without any documentation. The political use of the death toll continues to this day. Russian government sources cite the official 632,000 figure, maintaining the Soviet narrative. Western historians cite 800,000 to 1.1 million civilian deaths, based on demographic research. Some Russian historians, working with newly opened archives, cite figures as high as 1.5 million total deaths. Each number serves different purposes, supports different narratives, emphasizes different aspects of the siege. The uncertainty becomes weaponized, used to attack or defend various interpretations of the siege, various assessments of Soviet leadership, various claims about the war's meaning. The dead, who cannot speak for themselves, become contested ground in historical and political battles they did not choose to fight. In the end, the precise number matters less than the magnitude. Whether 632,000 or 1 million, 100,000 or 1.5 million, the Siege of Leningrad killed more people than most wars, destroyed more lives than most disasters, inflicted more suffering than most historical events. The dead deserve to be counted, deserve to have their deaths acknowledged, deserve to be remembered as individuals, not statistics. But they also deserve to be understood as part of a catastrophe so large that individual stories disappear into collective tragedy, where millions of personal griefs merge into historical fact, where the arithmetic of death becomes so overwhelming that precision feels impossible, and inadequacy inevitable. We count because counting is how we acknowledge loss, but we must also admit that some losses are too large to count, too terrible to quantify, too profound to capture in numbers, no matter how carefully we calculate or how honestly we try. The dead of Leningrad deserve better than uncertain counting, but uncertain counting is all history can offer, all memory can provide, all that remains after catastrophe has consumed precision along with everything else. September 6, 1941, Wehrmacht headquarters, East Prussia. Adolf Hitler stands over a map table surrounded by his generals, studying the situation around Leningrad. Army Group North has nearly completed the encirclement. Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb argues for a direct assault. His forces can take the city in 2 weeks, perhaps less, capture or destroy the Soviet forces inside, eliminate Leningrad as a military factor. Hitler listens, then makes a decision that will haunt German strategy for the remainder of the war. He orders Army Group North not to assault the city, but to besiege it, to surround and starve it, to destroy it through artillery and bombing rather than street fighting. His reasoning is partly practical. Street fighting in a city of 3 million would cost tens of thousands of German casualties, but mostly ideological. Leningrad must not merely fall, but cease to exist, wiped from the earth as punishment for being the birthplace of Bolshevism. This decision, made in a moment, will tie down 25 to 30 divisions for nearly 3 years. Divisions that could have decided battles elsewhere, divisions that might have changed the outcome of the war. The strategic calculus of the siege begins with numbers. Army Group North deploys approximately 300,000 troops to maintain the siege perimeter, fluctuating between 250,000 at minimum and 741,000 at peak during defensive operations. These troops occupy static positions, manning trenches and bunkers, conducting artillery bombardment, defending against Soviet breakout attempts. They are not available for offensive operations elsewhere. They consume supplies, food, ammunition, fuel, equipment that must be transported to the siege lines and cannot be used by other forces. Most critically, they represent combat power frozen in place, unable to respond to crises developing in other sectors of the Eastern Front. Winter 1941 to 1942 demonstrates the cost of Hitler's decision. While Army Group North besieges Leningrad, Army Group Center attacks Moscow, coming within 30 kilometers of the Kremlin before being stopped by Soviet counteroffensive in December. German commanders conducting the Moscow offensive later calculate that they were short 30 to 40 divisions of achieving breakthrough, exactly the number of divisions tied down besieging Leningrad. Would those additional divisions have captured Moscow? The question is unanswerable but haunting. Moscow is the Soviet Union's capital, its transportation hub, its symbolic heart. Capturing Moscow in 1941 might have collapsed Stalin's government, might have forced a negotiated peace, might have won Germany the war in the East. Instead, Army Group North's divisions sit in trenches around Leningrad, achieving nothing except killing civilians through starvation. The Soviet perspective inverts the strategic calculation. Stalin orders Leningrad held at all costs, refuses to allow evacuation or surrender, insists the city remain a fortress regardless of casualties. His reasoning is partly symbolic. Surrendering Lenin's city would be devastating propaganda defeat, but also strategic. Leningrad Front, defending the city, ties down German forces better than any field army could. A siege is strategically inefficient for the attacker. It requires more troops to maintain than the defender requires to hold, especially when the defender has access to supply routes like Lake Ladoga. The Germans must defend a 200-kilometer perimeter. The Soviets defend a city with interior lines and concentrated forces. This force ratio favors the defender, meaning the Germans need more divisions to maintain the siege than the Soviets need to hold the city. Furthermore, Leningrad's continued resistance provides operational advantages for Soviet military strategy. Soviet offensives in other sectors benefit from knowing that Army Group North cannot reinforce other fronts without abandoning the siege. The siege creates a strategic anchor, fixing German forces in place, preventing the kind of mobile defensive operations that German commanders prefer. When the Soviet Union launches major offensives near Moscow, in Ukraine, in southern Russia, the Germans cannot respond by shifting divisions from quiet sectors, because there are no quiet sectors. Leningrad remains an active front, requiring continuous defense. In this sense, Leningrad's suffering serves broader strategic purposes, a sacrifice that enables victories elsewhere. This calculation is cold-blooded but militarily sound, which makes it no less terrible for Leningraders who pay the price. The comparison to alternative strategies highlights Hitler's error. What if Germany had bypassed Leningrad entirely, leaving minimal forces to contain it while using Army Group North's main strength for offensives elsewhere? The city would remain a Soviet bastion, but without consuming German resources. Soviet forces inside Leningrad might conduct raids, but could not threaten German strategic objectives while surrounded. This strategy would have freed 20 to 25 divisions for use in the Moscow offensive or for exploitation operations after initial victories. German generals suggested this approach in September 1941, but were overruled by Hitler's ideological obsession with destroying the city. Alternatively, What if Germany had conducted a rapid assault in September 1941, accepting higher casualties but capturing the city quickly? Army Group North's commanders estimated the assault would cost 20,000 to 30,000 casualties, but would succeed within 2 to 3 weeks. These casualties are significant but acceptable compared to what the siege actually cost. Maintaining 300,000 troops for 30 months equals 900,000 man-months of deployed forces, with actual casualties from combat, disease, and attrition exceeding 150,000 over the siege duration. A quick assault would have been costly but more efficient than prolonged siege, freeing forces for other operations by October 1941 in time to reinforce the Moscow offensive. The Finnish factor complicates the strategic picture. Finland, allied with Germany against the Soviet Union, advances to the pre-Winter War border north of Leningrad, but refuses to advance further, refuses to participate in the city's encirclement from the north. Finnish Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, commander of Finnish forces, declines German requests to attack Leningrad directly, stating his objective is to recover territory lost to the Soviet Union in the Winter War, not to conquer Soviet cities. This decision weakens the siege, allowing the Soviets to concentrate defenses on southern and western approaches, reducing the perimeter the Germans must attack. If Finland had fully committed to capturing Leningrad, the city might have fallen. But Finnish restraint, based on Finland's limited war aims and Mannerheim's understanding that attacking Leningrad would make post-war relations with the Soviet Union impossible, denies Germany a decisive advantage. Post-war interrogations of German commanders reveal their assessment of the siege as strategic disaster. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable generals, states, "The siege of Leningrad was a strategic error of the first magnitude. It tied down forces desperately needed elsewhere while achieving nothing of military value. The city should have been bypassed or assaulted quickly. The prolonged siege served Soviet interests more than German." Field Marshal von Lieb, who commanded Army Group North during the encirclement, writes in his memoirs that he argued against the siege repeatedly but was overruled by Hitler. General Heinz Guderian, architect of German armored operations, calculates that the divisions besieging Leningrad could have provided the margin of victory in the Moscow offensive, potentially changing the war's outcome. The ultimate strategic assessment is clear. The siege of Leningrad was a catastrophic German failure and a costly Soviet success. Germany expended enormous resources, achieving nothing except mass murder of civilians, tying down forces needed elsewhere, demonstrating the Wehrmacht's inability to take a major city against determined resistance. The Soviet Union paid a terrible price, over 1 million dead, a city devastated but achieved strategic objectives, fixed German forces in place, prevented their use in other operations, maintained Leningrad as a symbol of resistance, and ultimately held the city until it could be liberated. In the cold arithmetic of strategy, Leningrad was worth the cost to the Soviet Union, because losing it would have been worse, would have freed German forces, would have demoralized Soviet resistance, would have severed northern supply routes. But this strategic logic provides no comfort to the dead, no justification for the suffering, no redemption for the catastrophe. Strategy explains why the siege happened and why both sides accepted horrific losses. Strategy does not make those losses any less terrible, any less tragic, any less of an indictment of the human capacity for organized cruelty. The siege was strategically significant and morally inexcusable, simultaneously justified by military logic and unjustifiable by human standards, a contradiction that defines so much of World War II's Eastern Front. July 8, 1941, Berlin, Offices of the Wehrmacht High Command. Herbert Bakke, State Secretary for Food and Agriculture, presents a document to senior Wehrmacht officials titled Economic Policy Guidelines for Economic Organization East. The document, which will become known as the Hunger Plan, outlines a strategy of breathtaking cruelty. The German occupation of the Soviet Union will deliberately starve 30 million Soviet citizens to death in order to feed the Wehrmacht and the German home front. Bakke explains the arithmetic with clinical precision. The Soviet Union produces enough food to feed its population, but German occupation will divert that food to Germany. Soviet cities, particularly in the northern regions, will be isolated and left to starve. Tens of millions of people in this territory will become superfluous and will die or must emigrate to Siberia. Baka states, the officers listening take notes. No one objects. The hunger plan is approved and will be implemented across occupied Soviet territory. Leningrad will become its primary example. The Siege of Leningrad is not a tragic consequence of military necessity, but a deliberate policy of extermination through starvation, planned at the highest levels of the Nazi state and Wehrmacht command. This distinction matters profoundly. Siege warfare is ancient and, under certain conditions, legal under international law. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 permit besieging armies to surround enemy fortifications and cut off supplies to force surrender. But the conventions explicitly prohibit deliberate targeting of civilian populations, require besieging forces to allow evacuation of civilians, and classify deliberate starvation of civilians as a war crime. The German siege of Leningrad violates all these provisions, not through accident or military necessity, but through deliberate policy designed to kill civilians en masse. The documentary record is extensive and damning. Hitler's Directive 1601, issued September 12, 1941, states unambiguously, "The Führer has decided to wipe the city of Petersburg from the face of the earth. We have no interest in preserving even a portion of the population of this large city. Any request for surrender will be rejected. The city will be destroyed by artillery fire and continuous bombing from the air." Wehrmacht headquarters issues implementing directives that elaborate on Hitler's orders. Artillery and air forces are to target civilian areas, particularly food storage and distribution facilities. German forces are forbidden from accepting any surrender offers from Leningrad. Most significantly, German forces are ordered to fire on civilians attempting to escape through siege lines, preventing any evacuation that would reduce the population subject to starvation. Wehrmacht commanders implement these criminal orders without significant resistance. Army Group North's artillery conducts systematic bombardment of civilian targets: breadlines, tram stops, residential districts, hospitals, markets. The targeting is not random, but calculated to maximize civilian casualties while conserving ammunition. German artillery observers identify times and locations of maximum civilian concentration, schedule bombardments accordingly. The Luftwaffe receives similar targeting instructions. Residential areas, food facilities, civilian infrastructure. The bombing of the Badaev warehouses on September 8th is not a fortunate strike against a military target, but a deliberately planned attack on food storage calculated to create famine. General Erich von Manstein, commanding 11th Army before transfer to other sectors, writes in a directive dated November 20th, 1941, "The Jewish Bolshevist system must be eliminated. In enemy cities, a large part of the population will have to starve. Nothing may be supplied to the population out of a sense of misplaced humanness." Von Manstein later claims he opposed targeting civilians, but his written orders contradict this claim. Field Marshal von Lieb issues orders forbidding his troops from sharing rations with starving Soviet civilians, forbidding any humanitarian assistance, threatening court-martial for soldiers who help civilians. These are not decisions made by Nazi ideologues overruling reluctant Wehrmacht professionals. These are decisions made by Wehrmacht officers, implementing Nazi ideology through military means. The question of individual moral responsibility becomes complex in examining lower-level participants. Artillery crews firing on civilian targets, pilots bombing residential areas, sentries shooting at refugees attempting to escape. These men are following orders, operating within military command structure, doing what soldiers do in war. But following orders does not absolve moral responsibility when the orders are manifestly criminal. A German artillery officer, writing in his diary in October 1941, describes the orders to fire on breadlines. "We are told to wait until civilians gather to receive rations, then fire 2 salvos into the crowd. This is not warfare, but murder. But I am a soldier. I follow orders. God, forgive me." This confession acknowledges the crime but claims the excuse of obedience, the defense that will be rejected at Nuremberg. Post-war accountability for the siege is shockingly minimal. The major Nuremberg trials in 1945 to 1946 do not specifically address the Leningrad siege, focusing instead on the Holocaust. general war crimes, crimes against peace. The hunger plan is mentioned in prosecution documents, but not extensively prosecuted. The siege deaths are attributed to general Nazi aggression rather than specific criminal acts. Field Marshal von Lieb is tried in the subsequent Nuremberg trials in 1948, not for the siege specifically, but for general war crimes in his area of command. He is convicted and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment, time already served by trial date, effectively walking free. He serves no additional time for roll-in deaths of up to 1 million people. Other commanders involved in the siege face similarly minimal or non-existent consequences. The reasons for this lack of accountability are multiple. By 1946, international attention has focused on the Holocaust as the primary Nazi crime, overshadowing other atrocities. The Siege of Leningrad, occurring in the Soviet Union and involving primarily Soviet victims, receives less attention from Western prosecutors focused on crimes against Western Europeans. The Soviet Union conducts its own trials of German officers, but these trials are closed, secretive, lacking the international legitimacy of Nuremberg. Furthermore, the legal framework for prosecuting starvation as a war crime is underdeveloped. The Hague Conventions prohibit certain actions, but enforcement mechanisms are weak. The concept of crimes against humanity is only being developed at Nuremberg and focuses primarily on genocide and deportation rather than siege warfare. Modern international law has evolved to address this gap. The Geneva Conventions of 1949, written with World War II experiences in mind, explicitly prohibit starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. Article 54 of Additional Protocol 1, adopted in 1977, states, "Starvation of civilians as a method of warfare is prohibited." This language directly addresses tactics used at Leningrad: destruction of food supplies, prevention of civilian evacuation, siege conducted with intention to cause mass civilian death. Under modern law, the perpetrators of the Leningrad siege would face charges of crimes against humanity and war crimes with potential sentences of life imprisonment or death. But in 1945 to 1948, these legal frameworks do not yet exist, allowing perpetrators to escape justice. The moral assessment is clearer than the legal assessment. The Siege of Leningrad was a deliberate act of mass murder, planned systematically, implemented methodically, resulting in deaths numbering in the hundreds of thousands or millions. The planners and implementers knew what they were doing, understood the consequences, proceeded anyway. They created a policy designed to kill civilians en masse, not as collateral damage, but as primary objective. This makes the siege comparable to other Nazi atrocities, not in method but in intent and result. The deliberate killing of massive numbers of civilians for ideological and strategic purposes. The perpetrators deserved prosecution, conviction, severe punishment. That most escape justice is a failure of post-war accountability, a failure that has allowed some to deny or minimize the siege's criminal nature, a failure that undermines the principles established at Nuremberg. The victims of Leningrad's siege deserve acknowledgement that they were murdered, not merely died. They were killed by policy, by decisions made in Berlin and Wehrmacht headquarters, by orders given to artillery crews and bomber pilots, by a system of organized cruelty operating with industrial efficiency. Their deaths were not unfortunate casualties of military operations, but intended outcomes of criminal policy. Recognizing this truth does not diminish Soviet leadership's responsibility for failures to protect civilians, does not excuse decisions that increased casualties, but it establishes primary responsibility clearly. The Nazi German government and Wehrmacht planned and executed the Siege of Leningrad as a method of extermination, making them perpetrators of one of World War II's greatest crimes, a crime for which they were never adequately punished, a crime that remains one of history's clearest examples of how state-organized violence can transform siege warfare from military operation into genocide. Brooklyn, New York, 1957. Elena Skrzybina, who survived the siege and evacuated in 1942, eventually immigrating to America, sits at her kitchen table with her adult children. Dinner has ended, dishes are being cleared, a scene of domestic normalcy. One of her children reaches for a half-eaten roll, about to discard it. Elena's hand shoots out, grabbing her child's wrist with startling force. "You do not throw away bread," she says, her voice sharp, almost violent. "Never. You do not waste food, ever. Her children are startled by the intensity of her reaction, this sudden fury over a bread roll in a country of plenty where food is cheap and abundant. They cannot understand, because they did not live through winter. 1941 to 1942, did not watch family members die over a bread crust, did not know that food represents the boundary between life and death. Elena realizes she has frightened her children, releases the wrist, takes the bread roll, and wraps it carefully in cloth. "I will eat this tomorrow," she says, her voice now calm but still firm. "We do not waste." Her children will later report that their mother kept food hoarded throughout the house, old bread in closets, canned goods under beds, unable to trust that tomorrow's meal will actually arrive. The survivors of Leningrad carry the siege with them wherever they go, in their bodies and minds, in behaviors and beliefs, in ways they cannot control or explain. The siege becomes part of their identity, not something they experienced but something they are, a permanent alteration of personality and physiology that defines the rest of their lives. They cannot return to who they were before the siege because that person no longer exists, burned away in the winter of starvation, replaced by someone harder, different, damaged in ways that will never completely heal. This transformation is universal among survivors, varying in degree but not in kind. Everyone who lived through the siege changed, and the changes proved permanent. The relationship with food remains the most visible carryover. Survivors cannot throw away food, even spoiled food, even food they have no intention of eating. They hoard compulsively, keeping reserves hidden throughout their homes, some maintaining enough stored food to survive another siege. They eat everything on their plates regardless of hunger, unable to leave food uneaten. They become distressed when others waste food, sometimes angry, sometimes weeping, the waste triggering memories and emotions they cannot control. A survivor living in Moscow in the 1960s describes eating in a restaurant and watching another diner leave half a meal uneaten. "I wanted to go to that table, to take that food, to shake that person and make them understand that people died for less food than they just wasted. But I did not, because I am not insane, I am only damaged." The physiological damage proves permanent and progressive. Siege survivors develop cardiovascular disease at rates 40% higher than comparable populations, their hearts damaged by months of severe malnutrition that weakened heart muscle permanently. Digestive systems never fully recover, many survivors suffering chronic stomach problems, ulcers, inability to properly process fats or proteins. Women who survive the siege as children or young adults often experience fertility problems, difficult pregnancies, early menopause, their reproductive systems damaged by starvation during critical developmental periods. The siege's physical legacy extends to the next generation. Children born to siege survivors show higher rates of low birth weight, developmental issues, and health problems, suggesting epigenetic changes that transmit trauma biologically. The psychological carrying forward proves as significant as the physical. Survivors display symptoms that would later be classified as post-traumatic stress disorder, though the diagnosis does not exist during most survivors' lifetimes. Nightmares remain common decades after the siege, survivors dreaming of hunger, of cold, of watching family members die, waking in panic that takes minutes to subside. Hypervigilance persists, survivors constantly monitoring their environment for threats, unable to fully relax, maintaining mental preparations for catastrophe even when living in safety. Anniversary reactions occur, survivors experiencing increased distress around siege-related dates, particularly January and February, the worst months, even 60 or 70 years later. Survivor guilt affects nearly everyone who lived while others died. The guilt manifests in multiple forms, questioning why they survived, feeling they did not deserve survival, believing they should have done more to save others, experiencing their continued life as somehow wrong or illegitimate. A survivor interviewed in 1995, 50 years after the siege, states, "I am 80 years old. I have lived a full life, children, grandchildren, career, but I have never felt I deserved any of it. My sister died when she was 12 years old during the siege. She should have had these years, this life. Instead, I have them, and I do not know why. I gave her most of my bread, I did everything, but she died and I lived." This makes no sense, no justice. I carry her with me every day, her death, my survival, the unfairness of it. The 1960s and 70s mark a shift in how survivors engage with their memories. For 20 years after the war, Soviet authorities discouraged discussion of siege suffering, preferring narratives of heroism and resistance. Survivors learned not to talk about starvation, about cannibalism, about the moral compromises survival required. But in 1977, writers Daniil Granin and Elise Adamovich began interviewing siege survivors for A Book of the Blockade, collecting testimonies, preserving stories, giving survivors permission to speak openly for the first time. The book, published in 1979, becomes a phenomenon, selling millions of copies, prompting thousands of survivors to break their silence. The interviews are often the first time survivors have spoken in detail about their experiences, and the emotional release is powerful. Many survivors report that testifying helped them, provided catharsis, allowed them to process trauma that had been suppressed for decades. But not all survivors want to speak. Some maintain silence for their entire lives, dying without ever describing in detail what they experienced. A survivor's daughter, interviewed in 2005, describes her mother. She never spoke of the blockade, never. If we asked, she would say it was difficult and change the subject. She kept things old ration cards, a piece of bread card, photographs of people I never met who she said were family. But she would not talk. I think the memories were too painful, or perhaps she could not find words for what happened, or perhaps speaking would make it real again in a way she could not bear. She died in 1993. I never learned what she experienced. Her silence is her story. Children of survivors report absorbing their parents' trauma secondhand, experiencing what psychologists now call intergenerational trauma. They grow up with parents who hoard food, who display incomprehensible anxiety, who sometimes wake screaming from nightmares. They are taught rules that make no sense in post-war stability. Always finish your plate, always keep emergency supplies, never trust that safety will continue, never believe that today's abundance will be tomorrow's reality. These lessons, appropriate for siege conditions, prove maladaptive in normal life but cannot be unlearned. Children of survivors often develop their own anxieties, their own compulsive behaviors around food and security, trauma transmitted not genetically but through learned behavior and emotional environment. The 1990s bring new challenges as the Soviet Union collapses and archives open. Survivors learn for the first time about decisions that increase their suffering. Stalin's refusal to allow evacuation, the deliberate choice to maintain the city as a military objective despite knowing the cost, the prioritization of military supply over civilian supply. These revelations prove devastating for some survivors who believed their suffering served necessary purposes, who trusted that authorities did everything possible to help them. Learning that their survival depended partly on luck, partly on official indifference to civilian life, partly on strategic calculations that valued the city's symbolic importance over its inhabitants' lives, forces re-evaluation of memories, reassessment of meanings they had assigned to their experience. By 2025, fewer than 2,000 blockade survivors remain alive, nearly all over 90 years old, time and mortality claiming more survivors each year. The last witnesses are dying, taking their direct memories with them. Oral history projects rush to record final testimonies, racing against time, but many survivors die before being interviewed, their stories lost forever. The survivors who remain carry their experiences with remarkable clarity. The siege burned into memory so deeply that even advanced age cannot erase it. A 96-year-old survivor, interviewed in 2023, describes the winter of 1941. I can remember that winter better than I remember last week. I can tell you the exact ration amounts, the taste of the bread, the temperature in our apartment, the name of every person in our building who died. Those memories are permanent. I will carry them until I die, which will be soon. And then there will be no one left who remembers, who was there, who can say this is what happened to us. I worry that when we are gone, people will forget, or will not believe, or will think we exaggerate. But we do not exaggerate. If anything, we cannot describe how bad it truly was. Words are inadequate. Memory is inadequate. Only those who were there can know, and soon we will all be dead. What the survivors carry forward is testimony, witness, refusal to allow the siege to be forgotten or minimized or reduced to statistics. They carry the obligation to speak for the dead, to ensure that the million who did not survive are remembered, are acknowledged, are counted among history's victims. They carry the knowledge, earned through suffering impossible to fully communicate, that humans can endure almost anything but should not have to, that survival is possible under conditions that should not exist, that the capacity to inflict suffering is matched only by the capacity to endure it. They carry wisdom born of catastrophe, understanding of what matters, intolerance for triviality, appreciation for life precisely because they nearly lost it. And they carry damage, permanent physical and psychological scars, the price paid for survival, which they bear without complaint, because complaint achieves nothing, because they are still alive when so many are not, because carrying damage forward is better than not being here to carry it. The survivors are living monuments to the siege, embodiments of its history, proof that what seems impossible to endure can be endured. They will not live forever. But while they live, they carry Leningrad forward, ensuring the siege remains not merely history, but living memory, present reality, warning about human capacity for both cruelty and endurance that future generations ignore at their peril. May 9th, 1945, Victory Day. Leningrad celebrates with parades, speeches, crowds filling Palace Square. Marshal Govorov, commander who led the liberation, stands on the reviewing platform as columns of soldiers and civilians march past. The speeches emphasize heroism, sacrifice, Communist Party leadership, Soviet determination. What the speeches do not mention: the starvation deaths, the cannibalism, the NKVD executions during the siege, Stalin's refusal to allow evacuation, the question of whether the siege could have been prevented or shortened by different Soviet decisions. These omissions are not accidental, but deliberate. From the moment of victory, the battle for memory begins. The struggle over what the siege means, how it will be remembered, whose stories will be told, and whose will be suppressed. This battle will continue for 80 years and counting, shaping how the siege is understood, commemorated, and weaponized for political purposes. The official Soviet narrative, established during the war and maintained until the Soviet Union's collapse, presents the siege in simple terms. Nazi Germany attempted to destroy Leningrad. The heroic Soviet people resisted under Communist Party leadership. The city was defended and eventually liberated, proving Soviet superiority and determination. This narrative emphasizes correct elements: German responsibility for the siege, Soviet determination, ultimate victory, but systematically omits uncomfortable facts that complicate the heroic story. The narrative does not mention that Stalin refused to allow evacuation of civilians, even when evacuation was possible. It does not mention that Soviet authorities prioritized military supply over civilian supply, allowing civilians to starve while military forces remained relatively well fed. It does not mention the NKVD's role during the siege: 26,000 arrests for defeatism and anti-Soviet agitation, hundreds of executions, 2,000 prosecutions for cannibalism. The official death toll, 632,000, becomes enshrined in Soviet historiography and remains official even after evidence suggests the real number is substantially higher. Why maintain an undercount? Because acknowledging 1 million or more deaths raises questions about Soviet leadership's responsibility, about whether different decisions might have reduced casualties, about whether the cost was justified by the strategic benefit. A higher death toll makes the siege look less like heroic defense and more like catastrophic policy failure. The official number represents the maximum loss that can be acknowledged without undermining the heroic narrative, a political calculation masquerading as historical fact. Survivors learn quickly that certain stories are acceptable and others are not. Stories of heroism, resistance, continued cultural life, determination to survive, these are welcomed, encouraged, published in newspapers and books. Stories of starvation's degrading effects, of moral compromises, survival required, of people dying in ways that strip away dignity, of desperation, driving people to cannibalism, these are suppressed, discouraged, punished if spoken to publicly. Survivors who speak about the worst aspects of the siege risk investigation by the NKVD, loss of employment, denial of benefits. The message is clear. Speak of suffering if you must, but frame it as heroic suffering. Suffering that was chosen and accepted, not suffering that was imposed and endured. Tell stories that glorify the Soviet system, not stories that reveal its failures. The 1960s bring the first slight opening in the official narrative. Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign allows limited criticism of Stalin-era policies, creating space for more honest discussion of the siege. In 1960, Piskarovskoye Memorial Cemetery is dedicated with ceremonies that acknowledge, for the first time, the scale of civilian death. The memorial's inscription, written by siege survivor and poet Olga Berggoltz, reads, "No one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten." But even this memorial involves political compromise. The original design included specific reference to starvation deaths, but officials demand removal of this language, insisting the memorial emphasize resistance and heroism rather than suffering and death. Berggoltz fights for her inscription, winning some battles, losing others, the final memorial representing negotiated memory rather than complete truth. 1965, the 20th anniversary of victory, Leningrad receives the official designation Hero City, one of 12 Soviet cities awarded this honor for exceptional resistance during the war. The designation comes with propaganda benefits, books, films, commemorations emphasizing Leningrad's heroism but also reinforces the official narrative. Hero cities are sites of triumph, not tragedy. The focus remains on what Leningraders achieved, not what was done to them, on their agency rather than their victimization. This framing serves political purposes, allowing the Soviet state to celebrate the siege as validation of Soviet superiority while avoiding questions about Soviet leadership's role in the catastrophe. The 1970s and 80s see renewed efforts by historians and survivors to document the siege more completely. Daniil Granin and Alice Adamovich's A Book of the Blockade, published in 1979 after years of censorship battles, presents unvarnished survivor testimonies including discussions of starvation, cannibalism, NKVD repression. The book is controversial. Some Soviet officials arguing it focuses too much on suffering, undermines the heroic narrative, serves Western propaganda by revealing Soviet failures. But the book becomes hugely successful, selling millions of copies, validating survivors' experiences, demonstrating hunger for historical truth beyond official propaganda. Other historians begin accessing archives, publishing research that challenges official numbers and narratives, slowly building a more complete picture despite political resistance. 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. Archives open, or partially open, revealing documents that had been secret for 50 years. Historians discover Stalin's telegrams to Leningrad commanders, revealing his refusal to allow evacuation, his threats to execute commanders who suggested abandoning the city, his prioritization of the city's symbolic value over civilian lives. They discover NKVD reports documenting arrests, executions, cannibalism cases, internal assessments of civilian morale and suffering that acknowledge realities the public narrative denied. They discover food supply documents showing that military forces received adequate rations throughout the siege, while civilian rations dropped to starvation levels, revealing the deliberate choice to prioritize military over civilian survival. These revelations proved devastating for some survivors who had believed the official narrative, who thought their government did everything possible to save them, who framed their suffering as necessary sacrifice for ultimate victory. Learning that their suffering resulted partly from Soviet policy choices, that evacuation was prevented by Stalin's orders, that civilian deaths were accepted as necessary cost of maintaining the city as a military objective, forces painful reassessment. Some survivors reject the new evidence, maintaining belief in the official narrative because abandoning it requires acknowledging that their loved ones' deaths might have been preventable. Others embrace the truth, angry at having been lied to for decades, determined to ensure the full story is told before they die. The 21st century brings new political battles over siege memory. Vladimir Putin's government, seeking to rebuild Russian national identity around World War II victory, promotes the siege as example of Russian determination and Western hostility. The official narrative softens slightly, acknowledging higher death tolls, admitting some Soviet leadership failures but maintains focus on heroism and resistance. New laws criminalize falsification of history, making it illegal to criticize Soviet conduct of the war, potentially prosecuting historians who emphasize Soviet failures or question official narratives. The siege becomes, once again, a political tool, used to foster patriotism, justify current policies, position Russia as victim of Western aggression. International scholars, particularly after the Soviet collapse, produce research examining the siege from perspectives the Soviet narrative suppressed. They analyze the German decision-making, documenting the deliberate policy of extermination through starvation. They examine Soviet leadership decisions, assessing Stalin's responsibility for civilian casualties. They study the siege's long-term demographic and psychological impacts. They compare Leningrad to other sieges and mass atrocities, contextualizing it within broader patterns of 20th century violence. This scholarship often conflicts with Russian official narratives, creating tensions between historical accuracy and political utility of memory. The survivors themselves, in their final years, become increasingly vocal about the need for complete truth. They understand that once they die, direct memory of the siege dies with them, leaving only archives, histories, and monuments to carry memory forward. Many survivors participate in oral history projects, determined to record their experiences, including the parts that official narratives omit. A survivor, interviewed in 2015, states, "I am 93 years old. I will die soon. I must tell the truth while I can. Yes, we resisted heroically. Yes, we survived impossible conditions. But we also suffered terribly, unnecessarily, because of decisions our own government made. Both things are true. History must acknowledge both. The heroism was real. The unnecessary suffering was also real. Denying either is dishonest. The battle for memory continues because memory has power, shapes identity, influences present politics. How Russia remembers the siege affects how Russians understand their relationship with the West, with Germany, with their own government. How the world remembers the siege affects how the Holocaust is contextualized, how Soviet war efforts are assessed, how siege warfare is evaluated under international law. The siege is simultaneously historical event and political symbol, fact and myth, tragedy and triumph, depending on who tells the story and why. The million dead cannot speak for themselves. The survivors who can speak are dying. What remains is contested memory, political narrative, historical analysis, all struggling to define what the siege means, what lessons it teaches, what obligations it creates for those who remember. The battle for memory is, in its way, a continuation of the siege itself, fought with different weapons but with equally high stakes, control over how one of history's greatest catastrophes is understood, commemorated, and used to shape the present and future. January 27th, 2024, the 80th anniversary of the siege's end. Piskarovskoye Memorial Cemetery, early morning, temperature -15 degrees Celsius. Several hundred people gather at the eternal flame, most of them descendants of survivors, some of them survivors themselves, now in their 90s, bundled in coats and scarves, leaning on canes or sitting in wheelchairs. The memorial complex stretches behind them, mass graves marked by numbered stones, pavilions with walls listing dates and death counts, the statue of Mother Russia holding a wreath, 6 meters tall, looking down on the graves with an expression that might be grief or might be determination. The inscription carved into the wall reads, "No one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten." But standing here, watching survivors who will not live to see the 85th anniversary, the promise feels both essential and impossible. How do you remember 1 million dead? How do you ensure nothing is forgotten when the witnesses are disappearing? The scope of the Siege of Leningrad remains difficult to grasp even 80 years later. 872 days, often rounded to 900 days in Russian memory. From September 8, 1941, when the encirclement closed, to January 27, 1944, when Soviet forces pushed German forces far enough from the city that artillery bombardment ceased. 2 years, 4 months, and 19 days. 900 days of siege warfare, of starvation, of artillery bombardment, of death on a scale that exceeds comprehension. The siege killed more people than most wars. More than Britain lost in all of World War II. More than the United States lost in all of World War II. More, possibly, than Britain and the United States combined lost in all of World War II. The death toll, somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million, when military and civilian deaths are combined, makes Leningrad the deadliest siege in modern history, deadlier than any siege in the ancient world, deadlier than most battles. The comparisons help place Leningrad in context, while simultaneously demonstrating how context-defying the siege truly was. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki together killed approximately 200,000 people in 2 days, creating weapons so terrible that the world agreed never to use them again. Leningrad's siege killed 5 to 7 times as many people over 900 days, using only conventional weapons, artillery, bombs, and starvation. The Holocaust killed 6 million Jews, the defining atrocity of World War II, demonstrating industrial genocide at its most systematic. The Siege of Leningrad killed 1/6 as many people in a single city, demonstrating that mass death does not require death camps, only encirclement and indifference. The siege demonstrates something about human capacity for inflicting and enduring suffering that should be impossible but is not. The legacy of the siege extends far beyond the death toll. Leningrad lost not just people but generations. The children who died in winter, 1941 to 42, would have been in their 80s now, would have had children and grandchildren, would have been teachers, doctors, artists, workers, the foundation of a society. The cultural losses, though the Hermitage's treasures were saved through evacuation, include theaters destroyed, musicians starved, writers silenced. The economic losses include 3 years of industrial production diverted to mere survival, infrastructure destroyed, human capital annihilated. The psychological losses affect not just survivors, but their descendants. Trauma transmitted across generations. The siege's effects ripple forward through time, touching lives decades later, shaping the present even now. The strategic significance, analyzed coldly, demonstrates that both sides achieved their minimum objectives while failing their maximum objectives. Germany failed to capture or destroy Leningrad, failed to free up forces for use elsewhere until forced to retreat, demonstrated that the Wehrmacht could not take a major city against determined resistance. The Soviet Union held Leningrad, maintained it as a symbol of resistance, tied down German forces that could not be used in other operations, eventually liberated the city. But the cost for the Soviet Union, over 1 million dead, a city devastated, was catastrophically high, perhaps higher than any military objective justified. Whether the siege was worth it depends on impossible counterfactuals. What would have happened if Leningrad had been evacuated, or surrendered, or fallen? Would the Soviet Union have survived? Would the war have ended differently? The moral assessment is clearer than the strategic assessment. The siege of Leningrad was a crime, planned and executed by Nazi Germany as a method of extermination, enabled by Wehrmacht commanders who implemented genocidal orders, resulting in deaths numbering in the millions. The perpetrators deserved prosecution and punishment. Most escaped justice. This failure of accountability remains one of the war's enduring injustices, allowing some to minimize or deny the siege's criminal nature, allowing perpetrators to live out their lives unpunished. At the same time, Soviet leadership bears responsibility for decisions that increase civilian suffering, refusing evacuation, prioritizing military over civilian supply, maintaining the city as a military objective regardless of cost. Both things are true. The siege was a German crime and a Soviet policy failure. Acknowledging one does not diminish the other. The survivors, the final witnesses, offer perspective unavailable from any other source. A 95-year-old woman, survivor of the first winter, interviewed at Piskarovskoye. People ask me how we survived. I tell them, we survived because we had no choice. Every day, we made the choice to live one more day, not for heroism, not for Stalin, not for the motherland, though we said those things because we were supposed to. We survived because each morning we woke up and decided that today we would not die. Tomorrow, we might die. Yesterday, others died. But today, we would live. We did this 900 times, and those of us who made that choice enough times survived. Those who gave up, or could not continue, or were simply unlucky, died. I survived because I was strong enough and lucky enough. My parents were not lucky enough. My sister was not strong enough. My brother was both but died anyway when a shell hit the factory where he worked. Survival was not virtue. Death was not weakness. Both were mostly chance, with a little bit of determination mixed in. The question of meaning, what does the siege mean? What lessons does it teach? What obligations does it create? Remains contested. The Russian government emphasizes heroism, resistance, the superiority of Soviet determination over Nazi aggression. This narrative contains truth but is incomplete, omitting Soviet failures and civilian suffering that complicate heroic framing. Western scholars emphasize the siege as war crime, as example of Nazi brutality, as case study in siege warfare and genocide. This narrative also contains truth, but sometimes reduces Leningraders to passive victims, minimizing their agency and resistance. Survivors often reject both narratives, insisting that the siege was simultaneously heroic resistance and terrible suffering, that both aspects must be acknowledged, that simplification serves politics at history's expense. What should be remembered? Everything. The siege must be remembered as German crime, as deliberate policy of extermination through starvation, as example of how military operations can become genocide. It must be remembered as Soviet failure, as consequence of decisions that prioritize symbolic value over civilian lives, as demonstration of how totalitarian systems sacrifice citizens for abstract objectives. It must be remembered as example of human endurance, of people surviving conditions that should be unsurvivable, of culture and civilization persisting through barbarism. It must be remembered as tragedy, as loss of 1 million lives, as suffering so extreme it damaged survivors permanently. It must be remembered completely, honestly, without simplification or political manipulation, as the complex, terrible, remarkable event it was. The practical question becomes, how do you remember when the witnesses die? The last survivors are in their 90s. We'll all be dead within a decade. Direct memory will end. What remains will be recorded testimony, archives, histories, monuments, artistic representations. These are not equivalent to lived experience, but are what will exist. The obligation falls to historians, to educators, to memorial institutions, to descendants, to anyone who believes the siege matters, to preserve memory as completely as possible, to fight against forgetting, to resist political manipulation of memory, to ensure that the dead are not forgotten and nothing of their experience is lost to convenience or ideology. The cemetery at Piskarovskoye holds 500,000 bodies in mass graves, possibly more. Walking among the graves, reading the stones, 1,942. 5,000 buried here, 1,942. 6,800 buried here, 1,943. 4,200 buried here, the numbers become numbing. Each number represents individuals, people with names and families and futures, reduced to count. But the numbers must be cited because they demonstrate scale, because scale matters, because the difference between 60,000 dead and 1 million dead is not quantitative, but qualitative, changing the nature of the event. The siege killed so many people that individual stories disappear into collective tragedy, but disappearing them entirely dishonors their memory. Somehow, memory must hold both the individual and the collective, both the personal grief and the statistical catastrophe, both the specific and the general. The current residents of St. Petersburg, the city's name restored after the Soviet collapse, navigate a landscape shaped by siege memory but marked by modern life. The city is beautiful again, rebuilt, thriving, home to 5 million people, no visible scars remaining from the siege. Young people walk streets where bodies lay frozen 80 years ago, unaware of the history beneath their feet. Cafes and shops occupy buildings where people starved. The Hermitage displays its treasures to tourists who do not know they were saved by evacuation during the siege. This is appropriate, necessary, healthy. Cities must be lived in, not preserved as monuments. But it creates tension between memory and progress, between honoring the past and embracing the future, between ensuring the siege is never forgotten and allowing the city to be something other than a memorial to suffering. The Siege of Leningrad demonstrates the extremes of human capacity, the capacity to inflict suffering, to endure suffering, to resist, to survive, to die, to remember. It demonstrates that humans can survive conditions that seem unsurvivable, but that survival comes with permanent cost. It demonstrates that political and military leaders can make decisions resulting in deaths numbering in the millions, while viewing those deaths as acceptable costs. It demonstrates that some events are too large, too terrible, too complex to fully comprehend, that understanding remains always partial, always inadequate, that the full reality exceeds what language can capture or memory can preserve. It demonstrates that humans need meaning, need to understand suffering as serving some purpose, but that some suffering serves no purpose except to demonstrate suffering itself, that not all tragedy contains redemption, that some things simply are terrible and remain terrible no matter how much meaning we try to extract from them. 900 days, 872 days precisely, 1 million dead, more or less. These numbers define the siege but do not explain it, cannot convey what it meant to live through it, cannot describe how it felt to watch a city die and be reborn, cannot communicate the texture of daily life under siege. The survivors carry this knowledge, this experience that cannot be fully shared, and soon they will be gone, and the knowledge will die with them. What remains will be history, memory, monuments, warning. The warning is simple and terrible. This happened. Humans did this to other humans. It could happen again. Vigilance is required. Memory is required. Acknowledgement is required. The Siege of Leningrad must not be forgotten, because forgetting allows repetition, because the dead deserve memory, because the survivors earned the right to have their testimony preserved, because the future needs to understand the past, because 900 days of suffering demand recognition, respect, and the promise impossible to guarantee but necessary to make that humanity will do better, that we will not allow such catastrophes again, that we will remember, always, everyone, everything, no one forgotten, nothing forgotten, for as long as human memory endures,